crying in the meeting, but I'm not crying in the meeting. I have my tear duct surgery next week, so hopefully I won't look so weepy in the future. How's that for on the record, Nicole?
It might have been. I
Yeah,
can
that's
never
cool.
quite know when these start.
Cool. My medical issues are fair game.
Excellent. Okay, well, looks like we're good to go, co-chairs.
Okay, I'll get everybody started today. Good morning, board members, Oregon OWEB staff, and all of you online for joining us today. My name is Russ Hoflick, and I'm the co-chair of the Acquisition, Restoration, and Engagement Issues Committee, along with Dan Brown. We want to remind everybody, this is a virtual meeting. It's being streamed live on the OWEB YouTube channel, and it's being recorded. For those on the Zoom meeting, we discourage using the chat features. And the meeting materials can be found in the board committee section of the OWEB website. Committee materials are found on the bottom of the introductory page. The viewers can click on the relevant committees to access today's materials, as well as past materials, just for good reading purposes. The meeting is being recorded, as we said earlier. But before we get started, I want to remind everybody about our charge here today. We're charged with conducting a thorough review of the land acquisition program to eliminate non-essential requirements at both the front end and the back end of the process to meet the statutory and program intent of Measure 76. And I just also want to remind everybody that a pillar of the strategic plan is to be bold and innovative. So here's our opportunity today for all of us to ask ourselves, what does being bold and innovative look like? And what does that mean for the future of the OWEB program? So as we think about those questions, I want to go through introductions, and I want to call on first our board members who I know are present. Bruce Buckmaster, do you want to give a quick introduction?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Bruce Buckmaster. I am a lame duck pu public member of the board, a born and bred Hoosier. When I die, I'll be a dead Hoosier, and but an adopted Oregonian. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce.
I knew somebody was a Hoosier. I just lost track of who.
Is Mark Webb with us today?
I am.
Hey, Mark.
So, Mark Webb, live in Grant County. I'm the liaison for the Environmental Quality Commission.
Okay, and my co-chair, Dan Brown.
Good morning, folks. Dan Brown. I'm with the EPA, and I am on the board as a agency rep and a non-voting member.
And I see we have board member Jamie McLeod Skinner with us today.
Hey everyone, Jamie McLeod Skinner, a voting board member based in Central Oregon and sitting in on this committee based on interest in the topic. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie, for joining. It looks like Kelly, who is also a committee member, is not going to be with us today, but we'll give her a briefing after the meeting. Let's shift over to staff, unless there's any other board members. I'm not seeing any other board members. Okay. Staff, let's start with Miriam.
Good morning, Miriam Forney, Land Acquisition Coordinator.
Thank you. How about Sarah?
Hi, friends. Sarah O'Brien, OWEB's Executive Director.
How about Linda?
Is Linda with us? I don't see Linda.
We're on the list. Okay. Eric Williams.
Good morning, everyone. Eric Williams, OWEB's Restoration Grants Manager.
How about Liz? Are you with us today?
No, I don't see Liz.
Okay. How about Courtney? been invited, but
No, are you just working from the list of total invitees, Russ, or?
yeah. How about Renee?
Good morning, everyone. Renee Davis, Acquisitions and Special Programs Manager at OWEB.
Okay, any other staff?
Russ,
I will
Diane's not-
introduce
Oh, Nicole and then
myself for the
Diane.
record as well. Nicole Bettinardi. I am OWEB's exec assistant.
Okay, and I think that's it for the staff. Why don't we introduce our panel while we're at it and just get that part of the.
Hey, Russ, could we ask Diane as a member of the state enterprise to introduce herself too before we go to partners? I know she's not on staff, but she's one of the family.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
Good morning. I'm Diane Lloyd with the Oregon Department of Justice, and I'm assigned contact counsel for OWEB. Good morning.
Morning, Diane. Okay, let's start with our panel that is joining us today. This is a really exciting meeting in that we have a lot of experts joining us and giving us their quality time. Let's start with Melissa. Are you with us?
I don't think Melissa has joined yet.
How about Marty?
Hey everyone, my name is Amanda Martino, or Marty. I'm the Executive Director of Blue Mountain Land Trust. I'd normally be coming to you from La Grande, but staring out at a really beautiful foggy bay here in Astoria. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining. Is Claire Fox with us?
Hello, good morning. My name is Claire Fox. I'm the Conservation Director at Greenbelt Land Trust based in the Willamette Valley.
Thank you. Nate, are you with us?
I don't see Nate, but we do have Ryan, I think, from, oh no, that's different organization. Sorry, never mind.
How about Natasha? Okay, maybe I'm a little bit early on the panel. That's fine. All right. I guess at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Dan to review the agenda.
Nicole, can you remind us, do we usually invite other partners to that are on the Zoom call to introduce themselves? I feel like maybe we do, but I can't remember the protocol.
There is no protocol. It's up to the discretion of our co-chairs. We are happy to go either way.
Sure, let's do it. What the heck? It's a small family and we got a lot of dedicated people to this process. Let's see. Nicole, do you want to help me with the list here? I'm just struggling with a small computer.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. How about we have Carson and then Mark introduce themselves, and then Ryan.
Morning, everyone. Lovely to be here. Carson Kendrick. I'm the Conservation Director with Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark McLaughlin. I'm the Conservation Director for the North Coast Land Conservancy, where land trust based in Seaside, Oregon.
Morning, everybody. I'm Ryan Ruggiero. I'm the Director of the Friends of the Columbia Gorge Land Trust, and I'm a CULT board member. Thank you for having me.
Okay, and then I believe we have Joe and Brad.
Morning, everybody. Joe Buttafuoco, Executive Director of Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. Really happy to be with everybody this morning.
Morning. It's good to see everyone. Brad Nye with the Oregon Desert Land Trust.
Good morning.
Thank you all. I believe I caught everyone. I don't think I missed anyone, so I'll hand it back to you guys, co-chairs.
Dan, why don't you take over and walk through the agenda?
Sounds good. The agenda we have is a full one today, and it does not include some breaks, but I guarantee we will be inserting a break in there for a bio break at some point in the agenda. We're going to start out with public comments, and then we're going to move into staff presentation and committee Q&A, and in some context and follow up from the last meeting. And Renee and Sarah, we're going to rely on you guys to sort of lead us through that discussion that's going to include updates on land acquisition modernization work streams, the matrix of risk categories, which we're excited to talk about, history of conservation easements, and then a brief review of matrix of title restriction tools. And then opportunity, of course, for question and answers. And then we will have our grantee partner panel to get some feedback from our partners on the use of conservation easements, pro and cons, and a good Q&A discussion with them. And then we will talk about title restriction alternatives. And then we'll wrap things up. And with that, does anybody have any questions or concerns about the agenda besides the lack of bio break? If not, then I'll hand it over to Russ to kick off the public comment period.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So we've received written comments, and I want to thank everybody for the extensive materials that they sent. I want to thank Joe Bufico from Colt for submitting very thoughtful introductory materials for us. Carson, you kept us up late at night reviewing the details of the land trust certification process. It was really, really helpful. Natasha, your comments as well. Thank you very much. And I want to again thank Joe and the 14 members of the Oregon Land Justice Council for your extraordinarily helpful insights. And it really made me think hard about our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and the alignment with your efforts. And I want to thank all of you for those written comments. And I urge people to, if you haven't read these materials, to take the time and understand them in some detail. I think they really get to the heart of this issue about what it means to look at the modernization program and what we have to do to get ourselves outside of our comfort zone. So I'd like to remind everybody that if you're interested in we're going to be using the Zoom to give people time for their verbal comments, and we're going to use the raised hand feature, and we're going to try to give everybody 3 minutes for their comments. And let's give it a shot. And I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to actually drive us through the public comment process. So please raise your hands if you want to give a comment.
Okie dokie. Let us start with Joe and then Carson.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, co-chairs. Appreciate the opportunity to share testimony this morning as you continue to work on modernizing the land acquisition program. This morning, I'm sharing testimony on behalf of the Oregon Land Justice Council regarding our concerns of the use of conservation easements in this program. The council is comprised of one staff representative from 14 of COLT's members. We initiated this program in 2019. The whole effort is grounded in the belief that tribes and conservation groups like land trusts share common values. The conservation movement in the United States has played a role in perpetuating the disconnection of indigenous people from their homelands. COLT members have been reckoning with this history while building equitable relationships with tribes and indigenous groups. We want to acknowledge up front that COLT and its members, we don't speak for tribes. This testimony is based on our own experiences, our own relationships, and the learning we've been doing. Through these relationships with tribes, we've learned that easements create barriers to tribal sovereignty. We understand each tribe's unique. We understand that easements might be a barrier for some tribes, for others, they might not be. Indigenous people have cultivated place-based knowledge over millennia that informs their land stewardship and ensures healthy habitats. There is a connection between the health of the land and the revitalization of indigenous cultures. The conservation values that are the basis of our shared work in Oregon exist due to the long-term care of landscapes since time immemorial. We believe that conservation will be more effective and durable when we center the first stewards of these lands. We're hopeful that OWEB can be a strong partner to COLT in these efforts. Through our relationships with some tribal staff, we're aware of several tribes that are reluctant to work with OWEB because of easements. Collectively, we are concerned that the continued use of easements in OWEB's land acquisition program will negatively impact efforts to restore Indigenous stewardship, land access, and land return. For me, this is the strongest reason to consider a change to a different protection mechanism that hopefully has a significantly lower impact to tribal sovereignty. Some COLT members have had to search for other funding sources for projects when they're partnering with tribes. This is both due to the easements, prohibitive activities in the language of the easements, and also OWEB stipulations around restoration timelines. OWEB is aware that their easement presents significant issues to tribes. I'm going to run out of time, folks. Thank you for the time. We'll have time in the panel to cover any more issues that were in the testimony. And just not good at staying in 3 minutes, folks.
Thank you,
Me
Joe.
too, Joe. That's why I moved to the public sector, because I could never fit what I had to say in 3 minutes. So no, that was the purpose of the panel today. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, Carson.
Thank you. Good morning, Co-Chair Holflick, Co-Chair Brown, and members of the committee. It's great to see you all today. Sorry for keeping anyone up late at night. For the record, my name is Carson Kendrick, and I'm the Conservation Director for the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. Thank you for the opportunity to share some comments today as this committee starts looking at the first foundational question identified in the June memo. Should OWEB allow the use of alternative land protection instruments or continue to require the use of easements to meet constitutional directives and statutory title requirements? This question comes to the committee after many years of discussion between COLT member land trusts and OWEB staff working to identify barriers and areas of improvement in the delivery of the Measure 76 Land Acquisition Grant Program. Opinions of the easement requirement really range among land trusts. For some, the easement is too restrictive and burdensome, while others argue that the staff interpretation of rights and responsibilities under the easement can be restrictive. But most agree that the culture of risk aversion and complicated approach to project negotiation is a key issue at hand. In our panel later today, you will hear from the Executive Director of the LTA Accreditation Commission. Of COLT's 22 full member regional land trusts and statewide conservation orgs, 21 of them have achieved and completed multiple renewals of accreditation from the Commission. Accreditation itself is awarded to land trusts meeting the highest national standards of excellence in conservation permanence and includes a rigorous review process to demonstrate fiscal accountability, strong organizational leadership, sound transactions, and lasting stewardship of conserved lands. Simply put, the Oregon Land Trust community is composed of capable, fiscally responsible organizations that are organized to effectively manage the categories of risk identified by OWEB and the risk matrix provided to this committee. COLT and our members recognize that OWEB is a state agency utilizing public funds and must be accountable for the use of those funds. And OWEB directors have traditionally chosen the conservation easement as the most conservative approach to protecting the state's investment. But we believe there's a middle ground to be found here, knowing that land trusts are the very capable entities taking on the risk of managing these properties in perpetuity. We believe there's a compromise in OWEB's approach to negotiation and aversion to any type of risk. We hope this committee and OWEB can undertake a meaningful examination of the potential for other restrictions to meet obligations, consider more flexibility for land trusts to use their expertise and judgment in the long-term care of lands, and focus on customer service that is based on positive possibilities of projects. Thank you again for your commitment and dedication to these important questions, and we remain truly appreciative of the partnership between OWEB staff and leadership moving this forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carson. I would like to have a last call. If anybody else would like to provide public comment at this time, please turn your cameras on, raise your physical hand or your Zoom hand, whatever's easier for you. Okie dokie, seeing none, I will hand it back to you, co-chairs.
Okay, so thank you all for your comments. This is really helpful. Let's turn it over to Sarah and Renee for their kickoff of the presentations.
Thank you, co-chairs and partners for your comments in particular. Let me just get my screens rearranged here real quick. I'll pull up some slides in a second. The cat is not helping. Again, for the record, Sarah O'Brien, a web executive director. I just want to particularly appreciate public comment, both written and verbal today. I think our request, and for the panel joining us later today, our request to the land trust community and other acquisitions partners has been to bring us your frank, fair, open, and diverse feedback. And I think you did that in a way that really represented both the diversity of opinions and perspectives in your community and really brings kind of some productive space for us to work in. So appreciation for that. And also, I just want to say this is kind of a special meeting in my opinion because of that frank and open dialogue, and what we've done is our best guess about how we can get folks some additional back and forth and open dialogue around concerns and issues and potential solutions in a way that is, appropriate to the public meetings format, but also gives us more space for dialogue than the 3-minute restriction Joe flagged that I know can be super awkward for getting a complex story across the plate. So huge appreciation for that, and also just the openness that OWEB staff and board are bringing to this conversation as well. I think the story that you guys will hear today is real openness on the part of OWEB and our partners to say, like, these are a bunch of decisions that we made for a reason in the past, and it's a good time to re-examine those and see how they're serving us in the present. I think that'll be a discussion that'll serve us all, and really appreciate the productive and collegial tone that a collaborative tone that everybody's bringing. So I'm going to just provide a few sort of opening remarks or thoughts here to help us with framing. I do want to mention in the meeting materials that Nicole shared prior to the meeting and that are on the website, there is a context background document that I think the co-chairs in our prep conversation suggested we consider bringing just to reorient folks. And so I hope everybody had a chance to take a look at that. We'll revisit some of the key themes and in a more synthesized form here. But I do encourage folks to take a look at that because there is, as we've shared in the past, a pretty long history of back and forth conversations between OWEB and our applicant and grantee community about how best to operate this program and how to strike the balance that a number of us have flagged around transparency and accountability as a public grant-making organization, and also flexibility and responsiveness to our grantee partners. That's a complex dialogue that we want to keep going. It's evolved a lot over time. So the context here that's shared is really just mostly a short version of what's outlined in that memo that was included in the materials. We've had a number of these kinds of processes going back to 2013, some of them accompanied by rulemaking efforts during or afterwards to address these concerns, and we've seen ongoing feedback from partners that there are issues that have been successfully resolved through those processes. And there are issues, as we heard during public comment today and in the written comments, that remain that really require some resolution and some further discussion and work. It is that sort of pattern of recurring, like, let's try to fix it. Okay, no, not quite, or yes, but then also this, that really caused us to ask this committee to take on this mission, in addition to direction from Governor Kotek that Russ read some highlights from at the beginning of our meeting today, and ongoing feedback from our partners, both in public and private conversations. We have a focus at OWEB right now on finding ways to have a more integrated program structure and improve accessibility to our programs overall. And so all these things come together as context. And we know that when we have done this work in the past in smaller groups and private conversations and a breakout group here that maybe does or doesn't link back to a broader process, that some of the threads get lost, or maybe not everybody knows how a circle was closed. And so part of the goal here is nesting this conversation within the public meeting context, as awkward as it is, to make sure that everybody that wants to participate can and can do so openly, and also to do that with the board, who is, our policy and rule adoption, policy making and rule adoption body that, in coordination with me and the governor's office and our staff and partners, can help determine a direction to this program that we can then land either in rule or internal policy guidance in a way that makes it clear that this is the way that we're going to implement this program going forward as we begin to reach some conclusions on that. So that's why we're here, and that's why we're doing that in this context instead of, a little work group off to the side that reports back or doesn't report back. Every time we've done this, I think we've gotten better, more comprehensive, and more successful at it. And we have a spirit of continuous improvement at OWEB. We know that every time we go through a program modernization cycle, we don't solve all the problems or the concerns that are frustrating folks. And it's time to come back and work on this again. So a reminder that this is a work plan that has multiple process streams. Really appreciate the land justice comments earlier. And I do want to remind folks, oh, that's on a different slide. But I do want to remind folks that we have an ongoing conversation with our tribal government partners and some legal research and communications directly to address some of the concerns that Joe raised and were raised in public comments around the intersection between state-held conservation easements and the unique sovereignty and role of tribal governments as they come in a grant-making relationship as well as a government-to-government relationship with OWEB and other state agencies. So some examples of these issues that have persisted or let's say, continue to create some concerns or challenges in the program over time. This is kind of an overview of the agenda of this committee as it has evolved over the last couple meetings and the next couple of meetings. We've heard feedback from folks, as we heard, I think, in some of the public comments today, that our treatment of present and future habitat conditions and anticipated future conditions or requirements around active habitat restoration is a way that we use easements and the associated management plans that can cause some significant concerns and frustrations for partners. We saw a number of examples in written comments where recreation or cultural uses kind of sort of ran in conflict to the way that we're using easements. Tribal sovereignty considerations we've discussed and will continue to discuss. And we've talked a lot about risk and heard some feedback from board members last time that, boy, it would be good to dive into that question of what kinds of risk are involved and to what degrees in greater context. So Renee and others have been on the team, have been working with both board members and other external partners to do some work on that you'll see in your materials and that we'll talk about today. And there are those, as we heard in comment, that would just prefer or suggest that we expand the set of instruments beyond the use of conservation easements specifically to address some other title restriction instruments. And so that's the question we'll be primarily focused on today. So the role of this committee, as we've talked about in the past, is to help us chew this stuff over. And our goal is to go with some updates in our full October board meeting and talk with the board, have the co-chairs and staff and other members talk with the board about what we've been hearing, what we've been learning, some interim conclusions, and to go hopefully in January with some more robust set of recommendations based on this and our December meeting conversations. So, and we do anticipate there's potential that we could ask either in the January meeting or a later meeting, the board to consider initiating rulemaking as a response to this as well. So I think I mentioned this. We have a work stream directly engaging with tribal partners. I do want to take responsibility. We had invited a couple of tribal partners that are real familiar with our land acquisitions program to join the panel today. I was responsible for getting that request out somewhat later than it should have gone, and they weren't able to join us due to some conflicts. So we'll prioritize that for the December meeting, and I've definitely gotten the feedback from a number of folks, including OWEB board co-chair Kelly Coates, who's our tribal representative, that it's probably about time to start bringing these streams together. And I think the consistent, conversion of concerns around tribal sovereignty issues with easements is an indication that it's probably time to continue our government-to-government conversations, but also start to knit these work streams together. Renee, Miriam, and other folks on the land and water acquisitions team at OWEB have been working on some minor streamlining stuff that we could implement pretty quickly in advance of our 2025 cycle without delaying that cycle. We know it's a time of high demand and low sources of other funding on the landscape. So I really appreciate the work that that team and also with external partners through a work group co-hosted with Colt have done to figure out how we can do some low-hanging fruit changes to the program to improve accessibility. We are seeing a greater volume of proposals in for sure. And I think that's an indication both that it's a challenging time in the federal funding landscape, and hopefully also that folks see this responsiveness of this conversation and the intent to continue to work on the program improvements together. And we do, just so folks, I'm going to mention the next couple of ARE meetings, and then we'll dive into this one in real, for reals. I do want to mention the upcoming ARE meetings because, or meetings of this committee, in part because I think stuff will come up today that we're going to be like, yes, absolutely, let's bookmark that because all of the next meeting or the following meeting will be focused on that issue. And we want to make sure the panel had free reign to talk about issues without trying to fit them into our little meeting silos. That's something that Colt provided us some good feedback on. And so we're not trying to limit the discussion very much today, but there are a number of things that we'll say, okay, as board dive into this discussion, as board members in the committee dive into this discussion, we are going to have upcoming meetings in December, really focused on significant habitat and future habitat, the way that that designation and expectations turn up in our easement approach. That'll be the focus as we plan it now of our December meeting, and then whatever our next one is after that, March, I think, will be focused on, it's hard to count 3 months at a time, will be focused on access and use issues, including both recreational, potentially working lands, and certainly tribal cultural use, and how those kind of specific uses intersect. So welcome partners' feedback on all of those issues today. Just board members know that we have upcoming meetings where we'll dig into those with quite a bit more detail. There's a lot of words for a slide, and I'm sorry, but it's a complex issue. So I do want to orient the board before we get started. I've had a number of board members check in offline to kind of say like, okay, I've got the historical context. Where are we right now? And what is the conversation we're trying to have? And so I want to, 2 slides here before I hand it off to Renee to dig into the risk matrix and some of the other materials that we shared based on our conversation at the last meeting. And I just want to do a quick, like, here's what we definitely know, and we're going to hear more about today from partners. And also, here's what we need to decide or come up with a recommendation or have some dialogue and discussion to take back to the board in discussing whether and how to initiate rulemaking or other policy changes. So what we know that grantees have significant frustrations about either conservation easements per se or the way we're currently using conservation easements. You've heard that and you'll continue to hear it throughout the panel today. As Joe said, we're aware of these frustrations. We don't really know what to do with them, and that's what this conversation is about. We know, as Diane has described and Renee and others in the past, that we have a statute, beloved ORS 541-960, happy to pull up because I keep it open on my screen all the time, that requires us to use an enforceable title restriction instrument on land purchased with grant funds. And we know that other types of title restriction instruments exist, and they could be used with a rule change, which is very much within the power of the board to initiate rulemaking and take us through that process, if that is the path that we decide on going forward. We do know, and we've heard from council a number of times now, that there's a reason that we use conservation easements, and we'll talk about that quite a bit more today. They're the most logical option from a legal and risk management perspective because they were created to meet this purpose. However, people have concerns, and so you'll notice we're not coming at you today with a staff recommendation to either broaden or not broaden the set of instruments used. We want to get feedback from everybody and start to get guidance and direction from the committee, and then eventually direction from the board and probably also from the governor's office about the right path here. We do want to warn, and we'll talk in a little bit more detail later, that there are other instruments available to us. Some of them are even actually flagged in our constitutional language as permissible. But some of them will probably carry some of the same frustrations as conservation easements, especially for tribal governments. And the language of 541-960 will create some challenges there. So we'll dig into that in more detail later. And we're going to really try to identify, both for the board and for partners, what are the things that we can change within existing policy, where we have, an internal, within, let's say, existing rule and statute, where we have an internal policy or guidance or template that is sort of driving the way that we do business. What are the things that would require a rule change, and a rules advisory committee, and the sort of time process, but also a significant good deliberation and discussion associated with rulemaking? And what are some things that we really can't change what we're doing without statutory change? Without legislative action. And we will probably see solutions today proposed that fall into all three of those categories. So our goal is to slice and dice. And then what we want to know, what we're really asking for board and also partners feedback on, is what do we do with that? Where do we focus our efforts, and how do we think about the changes that need to be made to sort of bring this balance between transparency, accountability, and flexibility and responsiveness into a good sort of modern alignment with where we know partners are, and the capacity and approach that we know land trusts and other grantee partners bring at this point. So the big question we're asking today is, we're listening to everything grantees partners have to say to us and thinking about potential solutions, are these frustrations that can be substantially addressed by changing the way that we use conservation easements, maybe changes to our template, to our management plan, to our internal guidance? Or do we need to seriously consider opening up the set of instruments used in order to successfully address the frustrations that are limiting, as a number of partners have said, the volume of applications coming in? So we don't want to artificially do less of one of our two constitutional missions, because we've created a burdensome process in the appropriate name of public accountability and transparency. We want to restrike that balance. And so I'm getting into what Renee is supposed to be talking about, so I'll stop. But this is the question we would really like the board's reflection on. There's a huge temptation to dive into the language and tell us what we're legally allowed and not allowed to do. And I find that temptation all the time. And that's why Diane is here, so she can actually tell us what we're legally allowed and not allowed to do. But this question of whether or not to work within the existing rule or change the rule for a broader set of instruments, that's a policy decision that we're really going to look to the full board for guidance on. And as we said, you guys are our ambassadors in that conversation. And so if we find the question on the table here is that we really don't think that we can substantially address these issues by changing the way we use easements, and we really do need to open up the broader set of instruments, we have some questions about risk-benefit analysis associated with that, and the board and the governor's office level of support for that policy decision. And then we can kind of make a staff recommendation and head you down that route. And at that point, I'm probably done stepping on Renee's toes. And I would suggest we go ahead, unless there are pressing questions from board members, I would suggest we go ahead and start diving into this risk matrix, because I think a lot of what I said was more just set up for the conversation to come than anything else. So I'm going to hand it over to Renee. And if somebody has an urgent question, then please flag down the co-chairs and we'll take a little pause. Renee, it is a lovely color-coded spreadsheet that you guys have created here.
It's
and
beautiful.
Web loves color-coded spreadsheets. So this is a good opportunity for us all.
Thanks, Sarah. For the record, Renee Davis, Acquisitions and Special Programs Manager. We are walking through 3 different documents during about the next 40 minutes, and we will have time for committee Q&A, but just as a little bit of time orientation, I also want to state at the outset, I alone did not author the documents that you received in your meeting materials, other than the first one. So huge thanks to Miriam, to Audrey Squires, who is our drinking water source protection specialist, Robin Meacher, our OAHP easement specialist, for enormous contributions to development of these materials. So we're going to start with the risk matrix. So you all have that in your packet of materials. I know you can't see the details perfectly on the screen here, but this was developed at a great prompting by Bruce Buckmaster during the June ARE committee meeting when we were talking about risk. We heard some feedback from the Measure 6676 panel, and I think Bruce kind of encapsulated as risk has lots of parts. We're talking about just risk as though it's one thing. And it is not. There are lots of components to that and different calculus that needs to be considered. And for each kind of category of risk, there's also a range and spectrum of risk severity, if you will. And so, and Jamie, I'm glad you're here at this meeting today because you, I think, crystallized it nicely with, my mom used to ask, what's the worst thing that could happen? So what we tried to do with this risk matrix in response to some of that conversation is to start to bucket things into some of these categories of risk. So you'll see that on the left side, fiduciary, operational, the strategic policy, and then environmental and ecological. And so then for each of those, a little bit of a description, there can be different categories within each of those bigger categories, but also to give a sense of what is that spectrum of risk for each of those. So I'm not going to walk through each individual example, but just starting with fiduciary, there could be a situation, and this could be true with a land acquisition project, but it could be true in other OWEB grant programs too, where with land acquisitions, we are paying a grantee for a portion of due diligence, and something happens with the project and it ultimately does not result in a successful closing on a land acquisition. We would put that into the lower risk category because there are situations across our grant programs where at times we'll make a grant, something will change, whether it's realization about what is or isn't possible with technical design, or a landowner pulls out, and sometimes things don't come to fruition. That is a bit of a risk. There's lower risk, and I think our typical approach as an agency is to try to capture learnings from it. What did we learn collectively with our grantees from that? So if you look over to the higher risk categories in fiduciary, that could be a situation where ultimately the property in which we invested is not meeting the intent of that constitutionally dedicated lottery funding. So we would invest, if we're talking about a land acquisition, in a property that ultimately ends up looking a lot more like a park with a dog park component, playground, et cetera. That is a much greater fiduciary risk because that does not align at all with the constitutional intent of the Measure 76 funding for native fish and wildlife species and their habitats, and utilizing land acquisition to help protect those. If we move into operational, there are a couple different ways we can look at operational. That can be from the grantee standpoint, or it could be from the agency standpoint. So from the grantee standpoint, if we have a grantee organization that has a little bit less experience in designing and implementing projects, it could be that they don't reach closing at the time that they had intended to, or there were some unexpected issues that popped up that result in greater costs for the project. Again, that's, it is a risk, but it's a lower risk as opposed to, if you think about it from the agency category within operational, it could be that if we didn't require something like an environmental site assessment, and we find that on a property that's being acquired with Measure 76 funding, there's a serious risk with some toxics or some substances that are requiring remediation. That could be a much greater risk if we have chosen to do something from an operational standpoint that results in a serious issue to pop later. From the strategic and policy standpoint, a lot of this falls into what I would deem kind of political risk or public opinion risk. And so certainly, I think in that case, we have some lower risk issues. We've heard about them already today in some of the public comment. We've certainly seen it in the written public comment where grantees feel as though, or applicants feel as though there may be some inconsistencies or unclear requirements within the program that has prompted some frustration with the land acquisition program. So that is a real risk. It may be a lower risk, but that can start to spill into, greater risk if we're having undersubscription of the program. And then certainly, if we think about strategic and policy, we've had a few instances, and I'll talk about those a bit more with the conservation easement memo, where especially around the time of COVID, some of the properties in which we invested in faced some very serious impacts from unhoused populations that were very challenged in having places to live during that time. And so what we ran the risk of is serious questions being called on, is that investment meeting what the intention was, and what is the agency doing to help address that in coordination with the grantee organization? And then finally, in terms of the environmental and ecological risk, certainly there could be some lower risk considerations around if there are differences of opinion between the agency and grantees about what did we commit to by way of subsequent restoration after an acquisition. And some, that absolutely could have some ecological or environmental impact, potentially lower risk. We could move into more moderate risk, as I would describe it, if we are starting to see a lot more undersubscription of the program because of some of those frustrations, maybe in the strategic policy space, then we could be missing opportunities to protect lands that are at risk. And then I would put into that higher risk or highest risk category some of what I described previously, where if we have investments that are now experiencing unauthorized uses that are very counter to what that conservation intention was for native species and their habitats, then that could present a greater risk. So just trying to put some nuance on that risk conversation. We're really interested in feedback that you have about this, see if it hits the mark to help kind of lay out both different categories and different severities or considerations that you all might want to direct staff to kind of lean in more on or less on related to some of those different categories. So yeah, Sarah's teed up some questions to help prompt some feedback from the committee on these topics.
Co-chairs, if it's okay with you, I'd recommend we just pause a few minutes here and see if there's any questions. These are just prompts, right? You can talk about whatever you want to talk about, but if we can take maybe 5 minutes here and then keep going, we can bring additional questions back at the end, but just to sort of keep up the pace to make sure that we're not cutting into panel time later. Russ, do I call on you or do you call on you? Go ahead.
Please call on me. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Bruce for helping us conceptualize this risk matrix. I find this very helpful, but I'm having a hard time squaring this matrix for the land acquisition program and our protection of our reputation and institutional credibility with the same risks that, or perhaps even greater risks, that we are undertaking in the much larger restoration program from a dollar perspective. I think we have in that program risks to the fiduciary, operational, strategic policy, and environmental and ecological, but we do not have the embrace of the desire to have conservation easements associated with the underlying restoration projects. And how do we, perhaps there's a lesson to be learned about how we advance the acquisition program and mitigating risk through the restoration program that is moving forward without the burden of conservation easement associated with it.
Russ, can I share a quick comment on that? And then I want to invite Renee or Eric Williams, who runs our restoration grants program, to weigh in if they see fit or want to correct what I say too. I think this is something that we hear a lot from partners. I remember Kathy McDonald, I think, brought it up in our conversation with the Measure 76 authors panel. And for me personally, it really resonates. And I think that everywhere in OWEB grant making, you will see this tension between accountability, transparency versus flexibility and responsiveness. And there's even just from recent, program modernization work we're doing in the applications, more focused on the restoration side. We've seen an example of that as well, where we saw, and please do, Eric, correct me if I get this wrong, but we saw kind of an explosion of ineffective vegetation treatments, and then OWEB responded by requiring a lot of detail in the application process about, I forget if it's vegetation establishment or vegetation management planning associated with certain kinds of restoration projects. Over time, the outcomes of those investments have significantly improved. And now we're faced with the discussion of, do we roll back some of those requirements? Do we keep them in place? We do hear a lot from grantees, I think, that they're burdensome and excessive, and they were created in response to past problems. And so I think this one is more visible because it's a real estate issue. But I do want to share that it's something we struggle with across our programs is when we see a poor use of public funds going on, we try to put some additional structure and sideboards in place. And then sometimes either the original driver subsides, and I think the growth and capacity of land trusts and increasing number of accredited land trusts is an interesting example of that. Or we kind of take a second look at it and think, well, maybe we kind of overshot the mark in the level of rigor that we needed to, inflict on folks to be able to address that problem. But I think it's a totally fair parallel. And in fairness to all of our programs and partners, I want to share it's something that we do wrestle with throughout the agency. And I think it's that like kind of pendulum swing that tends to occur in public grant making organizations between more and less rigorous process. But I don't want to talk too long because I said we were going to limit our questions. That's my 2 cents.
Other perspectives?
I don't see staff jumping in to correct me. So how about if we continue on with board members?
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, as I read the risk spectrum as well as the type of agreements, I began to think of it in this way, and I appreciate Bruce bringing up the different kinds of risk and Renee. But the risk spectrum to me is talking about the risk if something happens. So we're talking about the cost or consequences of certain things occurring. When we're talking about the type of agreements, I think we should be talking about risk of these sorts of things happening. So there you have a probability assignment or likelihood. So I think in this conversation, it's important to think about risk both in terms of likelihood of something happening, and that's what Sarah was just talking about. And then aside from or in addition to the likelihood of something happening, what's the actual cost? And there's lower cost and higher cost, and that's what the spectrum or consequences, and that's what the spectrum was addressing. And I think we need to be tying the various types of agreement to the likelihoods of any of these consequences in the risk spectrum happening. So for me, it would be helpful to sort of be clear about that as we go forward to evaluate that.
That makes a ton of sense, Mark. That's helpful feedback. And I think one of the questions we'll have for you guys later today is, should we sit down and actually look at easement terms at our next meeting to be able to get to a like, this is the risk this was supposed to address. And then then we could probably introduce that like third axis to the spreadsheet of what's the likelihood of a significant risk here. Co-chairs, do you mind if we go to Bruce and then Jamie and then maybe dive back in and ask folks to just jot down their questions for later to make sure we have enough space?
Nope, that's what I was gonna do. Go ahead, Bruce.
Thanks, Dan. As I looked, I'd like to thank staff for the risk work. And as I was reading, and also thank the public comments, they were very enlightening. I would like to have come up with a better set of words to ask this question, but as I read the comments and the risk matrix, I kept thinking to myself, who cares? And I didn't mean that in a smart ass way, but simply, who is it that actually cares? Those of us who have served on various boards and commissions typically have contentious issues come before us, and there are people on both sides arguing change, don't change. We like it the way it is, don't. I don't see much of we like it the way it is from our partners on the outside. So as we contemplate making changes, I think we should ask the question, the potential question, who might care on this change? Is this going to raise the ire of what constituency? So it seems to me that the preponderance of caring right now is that we need changes. And I think we should respond to that. And I like the way that staff is setting that up, that potential up. But as we look at the various possibilities, then I think asking the question, who might care on this change, could save us some time in the process. Thanks.
Very helpful.
Th-
Thank
Thanks, Bruce. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you. And great risk analysis, great thought process. As always, just really appreciate that depth and that perspective. I want to take a little bit of a step back and ask a process question. And apologies if I should have asked this before. But in terms of the public comment and in terms of Sarah, some of your queuing things up and talking about the process going forward, it seems to me that we have two major categories we're talking about. We're talking about tribal and non-tribal, and and as you mentioned, we don't have any tribal representatives to be part of this conversation today, and so I really appreciate that awareness, and of course our co-chairs are not here to engage in this conversation as well. But I wanted to speak to process because what we're going through now feels very appropriate for the non-tribal process and getting feedback from and understanding from our partners who are here, our amazing partners who are here and providing that comment. And even our partners were saying, not speaking for tribes, but flagging some of those potential needs. I want to pose something that I would think is a more appropriate process, and this doesn't take away from our amazing staff, our amazing board members, in all of those aspects. But it seems to me, frustration I've heard from tribal members is when they're kind of brought in on the end part of processes. And so we've heard frustration from non-tribal members about tribal processes, but we don't have the opportunity, we haven't had the opportunity, and I'm sure it's out there, to hear directly, but also to really demonstrate our understanding that each tribal nation is different, or I should say confederated tribes, because there's many nations within, or several often within one tribal, federally recognized tribe. And so I wanted to suggest a process for our tribal partners and tribal nations, because of course this becomes government to government. Even at this level, we're talking about staff and agency versus is government to government, and you of course reference the governor and her role. So it seems to me that for tribal nations, the more appropriate approach, and this would be a lot of work, I recognize, but one, to get on the agenda of each of the 9 federalized recognized tribal nations within Oregon, and potentially even consider going to Idaho for conversation with Nez Perce, traveling to their respective council meetings when the agenda point comes up, to present some of this information and request feedback, not just from staff, but from the full tribal council, because those are the decision makers, and take their feedback, and then once that's consolidated, present to the governor, because obviously that's a government to government, and provides her an opportunity to think about and weigh in, and of course she's communicating directly with sovereign nations, and then bring that summary for tribal nations then back to this group, and then run it through the process that you mentioned, eventually going to the board with recommendations, because it does feel a little bit cart before the horse for even this group to be recommending or coming with ideas that would go to tribal nations, because there may be things that each of them have that is different from what's been anticipated or what some of the partners may bring forward. It may also, so we may not be aware of some of their concerns. They may also be fine with certain processes and not with others. Their ask may be very different from what we're anticipating. So it is a big picture process issue. And again, once it gets down to that final stages, anticipate some rulemaking to address and respond to. But wanted to get on the record that I think that's a more appropriate approach and feedback mechanism to hear from the actual tribal decision makers and join their process, not ask them to make time to join our process, but to show them the respect of going to their regularly scheduled tribal council meetings, getting the agenda, going to those meetings, getting their feedback in that manner. I think that's a more appropriate for the tribal considerations and how we're looking at land acquisitions, and so just wanted to share that.
Thanks, Jamie. I want to not take up too much more time, but I do want to share with folks a little bit more detail on what we're currently doing. And I think, Jamie, it's a helpful kind of compare and contrast with what you described to look for gaps. And I think this is something that we have worked on closely with our tribal representative and with council. And I think like I say, it would be helpful to kind of go through that step by step and see if there are remaining gaps. And we didn't provide this level of detail in today's conversation, so I just want to acknowledge that. What we have done is, as folks will remember, we talked about this a little bit in executive session, but I think it's really good to bring it into the public meeting context. We have, an older 2021 tribal assessment where a third party interviewed tribal partners about our grant making practices across OWEB in general, raised a number of these issues that are being flagged additionally now by land trust partners. Following on that, prior to my joining and under Director Hansen's leadership, a number of staff, including Eric, Renee, Liz Redon, and Ken Fetcho, our tribal liaison, went and did, I think, a staff level maybe of what you described at the council level, Jamie, go and speak directly with staff from each of the federally recognized tribes and Nez Perce to dig deeper with some additional questions. Since that period, and it has been a long delay on our part, and I want to acknowledge that, and I think if Kelly were here, she would probably speak to that as well. We've been undergoing a process of legal research, seeking guidance from council about a number of different threads in there, and easements were one of them, but there were a number of other areas where individual tribes staff identified potential barriers to access to this particular program. So we've been preparing a memo and letter back to tribes. That's in its final stage of review with tribal representative, tribal liaison before sending out to our tribal partners, saying these are kind of very similar conversation to what we just had with you guys with respect to the board and the land trust community. To say, here's what we can do with an existing statute and rule, here's what we can do with rule changes, here's what we could do with statute changes to address the program barriers that you've individually identified. And Jamie, you're absolutely right. They're quite different from tribe to tribe, both in kind of substance and emphasis on what folks would prefer we address first or more substantively. So the key gaps I see there, just compared with what you described, Jamie, is we're doing it more at the staff level rather than the council leadership and governor level. And so I think that would be a place where we'd want to check in with our tribal representative, tribal liaison, and potentially the tribal representative in the governor's office. And I think that's a point where your sort of link back to the leadership level is an important one to consider and talk through at the leadership level. Is this a conversation that we do need to make those visits to council, and or should that be on specific issues? And is it something that we need a more robust engagement with the governor's office to maintain the government to government approach, but just alignment within the state enterprise? So I apologize for not providing more background on that detailed process before, in the earlier parts of the meeting today. But I appreciate your comments on raising the issue in a public meeting, Jamie, because I think it allows us to kind of do a side-by-side comparison of where some gaps may still remain and to discuss those with our tribal advisors.
And co-chairs, if I just may follow up on that distinction made, a couple of things. One, staff to staff is very different from actually asking the tribal council members, decision makers. And also, if it's even, you mentioned a couple years back, sounds like 4 or so years back, I can think of at least 2 tribal governments who have dramatically different leadership at this point. And so it is a bit apples to oranges to go with. It's just like any nation or government has elections. There's different leaders come up with different priorities, and so dated information at the staff level is dramatically different from feedback that could come from a tribal government. And they will have their staff present at the meeting if it's on their agenda and queued up, and they will have received their briefing. So that leadership will be prepared to speak. So I think it's a very different process, and I think that level is important. With great respect and deference to our tribal representative, there's tremendous pressure on that one person to represent all 9 tribes and to try to speak for or queue up. And I think that is asking too much of that one person. And especially in this regard, going directly to tribal leadership, I think is appropriate to respond to requests for changes of system process, especially if some of the things being discussed and even proposed during the public comment is to turn over a lot more of the decision making. I think having a better understanding of and feedback from tribes at that level, I think is critically important. And so
Thanks,
I hear
Jamie.
what you're saying, but I do want to emphasize that point.
Thanks, Jamie.
I'm
Appreciate
gonna
it.
I'm gonna try to keep us moving along here. And I do appreciate this conversation as well as what you said earlier, Sarah, about at some point it's time to start stitching these together, because a lot of what I'm seeing in the land trust community is that there is an idea that eventually their land acquisitions may end up with tribal governments. And so stitching them together is going to be important. I'm also going to, before I hand it back over to Renee, I'm going to take the liberty to say to our partner panel that's coming up, if you could, when I look at the higher risk examples across all of these categories, a lot of what I'm seeing has to do with risk that the land isn't managed for its intended purpose. And so when you guys are talking to us later on this morning, it'd be good to hear your perspective about that risk from your perspective as stewards of land, like and it going to a federal government or it going to a tribe. It seems like the ultimate steward of the land is going to be the one who's managing that high risk category in terms of how the land is used. And so with that, I will kick it back over to Renee. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I am aiming for a hard stop at 10:20 to stick to our grantee panel. So it could be that some of this we pick up a bit later. I think all of these pieces are nicely interwoven, Sarah.
Yeah, Renee, we could probably also lump where I've got a question slide in between. I'll just skip it and then just why don't you run through both sections?
Yep. Okay, so conservation easement memo is the next item in your packet of materials. So starting off with the introduction, I'm just going to walk us through hitting the high points of each section. So starting off with the grounding in the constitutional intent of Measure 76 around both the funding itself and the focus on native fish and wildlife species and their habitats, and also the space for funding of long-term protection of lands and waters, and specifically acquisition of interest in land and waters through grants made by the agency. Also then tiering down, as we've talked about previously, to statutes for the agency that codify that. And then for the land acquisition program, we do also have administrative rules, and we have extensive programmatic guidance and requirements developed to ensure that both the grant program meets that mandate called out in Constitution and statute, and also through time has really worked to minimize risk to the agency's investment of public funds. So that's kind of the upfront framing of statute, rule, touch back to the Constitution, and also some of those program requirements. We historically have utilized conservation easements held on fee acquisitions funded by the agency to secure that investment of public funds and to provide that long-term protection of habitats for native fish and wildlife species. So Sarah, if you go to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about conservation easements generally. So the reason that conservation easements exist is really to benefit the public and to provide an entity that is not a neighboring landowner with the ability to enforce the terms of an easement. And so really getting into some of the specific authority to address these common law considerations, and typically intended to protect the property in perpetuity. So Oregon, as we talked a bit about, and Sarah pointed back to executive session, just underscoring that here in the public meeting, we've talked about the conservation easement statute that exists in Oregon, specifically authorized in statute, first starting in 1983, and calling out specifically the ability of conservation easements to provide that running with the land, perpetual protections that really are focused on conservation goals and intents. And this is a little bit different in terms of the statutory landscape in Oregon when you look at some other states. So for example, in the easement memo, it describes the Washington statute, which is broader in terms of the set of instruments that can be applied in this perpetual way to achieve this conservation goal or intention. The Washington statute talks broadly about easements, covenants, restrictions, other rights versus conservation easements specifically being called out for Oregon. Russ, would you prefer that I stop?
Yes,
And
if you don't mind, I just want to bring clarity to your point, or challenge perhaps what you were saying. If you read back into the Constitution in Oregon, it's entering into agreements to obtain from willing owners determinate interest in lands and waters that protect watershed resources, including but not limited to fee simple interest in lands, leases of lands, or conservation easements. The words but not limited to is intended, and it is broad, as the first panel described to us. It gives you free creativity to use any of the other tools. It is not limited to fee simple interest in lands, leases, or conservation easements. So I just want to bring that clarifying point of what the Constitution states to the conversation. So we just like.
Thanks, Russ. It looks like Diane's got a response to that.
Diane, I wish we'd brought your nice pyramid slide, but I can pull up I can pull up some statute if you're interested at any point.
Oh, thank you. So I just want to speak to that point being raised, because I do think that's an important point that we want to be sure that we're talking, that we're both on the same page about what we're talking about. So the language that Russ just read is the language of Measure 76 that was codified in the Oregon Constitution. That describes the sort of framework that you're working under in spending these funds. What Renee was describing is Oregon's enabling conservation easement statute. And so those are different things. The conservation statute applies to all entity, to any person. It describes how a conservation easement can be developed and is authorized in Oregon. And so both what you just described are, absolutely true, but they're completely distinct directives. And so Renee is talking about the instruments that are allowed to run with the land. Russ is describing, the instruments that were listed in the information provided to voters in approving Measure 76. So two separate things.
Thank you for that clarification. Renee, handing it back to you to.
Thank you, Dan. Yep, I'll keep cranking through. So in terms of easements, typically they focus on prohibitions of uses that otherwise would be allowed with the intent of prohibiting those uses to protect certain conservation values. So typically when we see these, oftentimes it's an individual landowner is interested in retaining their property, ability to do some actions on that. And another entity, for example, a land trust would come in and say, we are interested though in prohibiting X uses to achieve this certain conservation outcome. So overall, that is a conservation easement structure that many folks are familiar with. So the idea though is that other entity would serve as the holder of the conservation easement, stewarding that easement. They would enforce the restrictions within the easement. They would do things like document the baseline conditions. They would monitor to ensure that those conservation values are being protected. And if there is an easement violation, then the easement holder would have the legal right to enforce the terms of the easement. So just generally, that is kind of the lay of the land with easement structure. Management plans are sometimes used as a tool that's incorporated into the easement to indicate affirmative actions if there are expectations about a particular action taking place. This is different from, you may not do this as outlined in the easement. This is more kind of aspirationally, what is it that we would like to see you do as a landowner to achieve a particular outcome. So management plans can be used, but are not always used with conservation easements. So that's just kind of conservation easements generally. I do want to talk about OWEB's use of conservation easements. I think this will get into a bit of what Russ was describing. In the Constitution, it talks about what those interests are that can be funded. What we are using conservation easements for as an agency is to meet that title restriction requirement that Sarah described. So within the conservation easement memo, footnote 2 captures in its entirety ORS 541960, the title restriction requirement, which is the agency will hold a title restriction on any land that's purchased through a grant agreement to ensure that it's utilized, the land's utilized for those appropriate purposes. We have historically and currently are using conservation easements, given that they do provide the greatest legal assurance to the agency of meeting that requirement. That's based on multiple iterations and years of legal research that harks back to the existence of conservation easements as the standalone in Oregon revised statutes around their ability to run with the land, be perpetual in nature, protect those conservation interests, and they have withstood thus far legal challenge. This is not to say that there aren't other title restrictions out there that could meet ORS 541960. This is just a question of there is a bit more legal ambiguity in terms of the ability of those title restrictions potentially to withstand legal challenge. So I do want to touch briefly on the reason for that title restriction statute when it was first incorporated into the agency statutory set. There were concerns from constituents and legislators about if property was transferred from the original grantee, would the intent of the funding still actually be delivered by that property? And so adding the title restriction statute really was to ensure that the agency would have the ability to know about any transfer or sale of properties and to be able to, one, affirm that the land is still being used in alignment with conservation purposes, and two, be able to ensure that profit wasn't occurring from that. There was some concern that profit could occur if land changed hands, no longer a conservation focus, and there could be a benefit to an individual. So just wanted to ground folks in the why. So that is the agency intervention if disposition of lands. So let's jump to Sarah then. Oh, looks like Bruce has a question before we advance.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. At some point, I think it would be helpful for board members if we could have kind of an overview of what the history of easement violations and enforcement actions has been. All these, hypothetically, this could happen, but we, at some point, looking back at the history, I think would be helpful for us.
Yep, thanks for that, Bruce. And I'll sprinkle a few in later. So let's move next to, perfect, Sarah, thank you. How OWEB in practice implements conservation easements. So we do have the role of a conservation easement holder. This differs a little bit from, say, a land trust working with an individual landowner. The reason we're holding the easement is to meet that title restriction statute and to ensure that the property in which the agency invested is continuing to deliver those conservation values as outlined from statute all the way down through, or Constitution through statute, rules and program guidance. We do recognize that OWEB's land acquisition grant program does not exist in a vacuum. We require matching funds for our programs, and there have been instances where grantees are in a situation where there are other funders that require an easement or some other restriction, form of title restriction, and that can present challenges if there are mismatches between program funding intent. So I want to be very forthright about the fact that we recognize that those are some of the wrinkles that can come up and have come up periodically during the program. In terms of the structure of the conservation easement, that we utilize. So we've developed a streamlined conservation easement template for fee simple acquisitions and instances where we're helping to grantee to support purchase of a conservation easement with a private landowner. We'll have provisions that we've outlined for incorporation into others' conservation easements. Those really articulate OWEB's rights, our requirements, our remedies. So things like our ability to enforce the easement and monitor the property, notice requirements. We do also have management plan requirements built into our conservation easement template and expectations around articulating what would we want and expect to see with this investment in terms of future habitat conditions on a particular property. So I think, Sarah, we can move to the next one. We'll wrap up soon. Sorry, I have a teenager home. So practical considerations. One is that without a doubt, conservation easements have provided legal certainty to OWEB. So just to Bruce's point, there are a couple examples where we've had a grantee be faced with unauthorized use from unhoused populations. And they've been very forthcoming about those situations. We've been able to work with them to recognize an easement is out of compliance. There have been some pretty serious habitat impacts. We've seen that at Big Four Corners as an example, City of Portland property, and been able to work with that grantee who really dug in to address those issues and get the unauthorized access handled and also get the property back onto a restoration trajectory that we would expect to see. We have at times seen that conservation easements have benefited our grantees. There are a couple examples from the North Coast. One, North Coast Land Conservancy was faced with a way of necessity claim by a neighbor, and the state holding an easement was helpful to resolve that issue. Similarly, we had a situation with the Kilchis Preserve, a nature conservancy preserve, where there was some interest in removal of riparian plantings, and having the agency's easement in play helped to address that issue. Really, though, I think part of what this conversation comes down to is balancing that legal certainty with what we're hearing about in terms of grantee challenges. I think in delving into, as Sarah described, are the challenges with the CE as the instrument itself, is the challenge, or are the challenges with some aspects of how we're choosing in practice to implement easements. I think just delving into this, and I know shortly we'll hear from the grantee panel, can really help us to elucidate options for paths forward. So Sarah, do you want me to just briefly touch on the instrument matrix? I know we're a few minutes over.
You know, I think that you were right in the first place, which I should have known, Renee. I think it probably, what I'd recommend to co-chairs is we pause our presentation. Probably the panel will talk about alternative instruments. And just know that at some point we will bring this back to a conversation about that other statute that talks about how we implement and restricts the way we can implement the more broad constitutional language that Russ described. And that will be our litmus test is this an alternative instrument that we can implement consistent with our title restriction statute requirement? Or would it require legislative action for us to be able to use this tool? So that later we will, either later in today's meeting or in the next meeting, we can dive in a little bit more to that matrix. You've got it in your materials, so you can use it for reference during the panel discussion anyway. But I think that's where, you know, we see the broad language in the Constitution. We know this was consistent, and the legislature took go and look at that broad constitutional language and said, as Renee described, wait a second, how do we know that you're going to spend this on conservation purposes and that those will persist if the property transfers from one landowner to another? And so then we've got the easement specific statute. So those are kind of our constellation of statutory and constitutional sideboards that we need to navigate our way through. And all policies can change, but some of them are harder to change than others. So I was going to recommend, I talked so long that you got hands up, Dan. I'm sorry. If you want to take care of questions, you can, and then I'd suggest a break.
I'm going to take control of the meeting
here.
Yeah,
you win. Okay.
What we're going to do is before the panel starts, we're going to take a 5-minute bio break. And before that, we're going to hear from Mark and Renee. I appreciate, and Sarah, we can punt this because we have time at the end of our agenda to talk about this already. The title, the alternatives. So go ahead, Mark, and then.
Yeah, this just, okay, thank you. This just a request for Diane. I'd be interested maybe at the next meeting or in an email to hear why the conservation statute isn't an inappropriate or unconstitutional limitation on Measure 76 language.
Like is the title, do you mean the title restriction statute, Mark? Like
Yeah,
when they
yeah,
passed that, was
yeah.
that an inappropriate restriction on the Constitution?
Yeah, and I'm sure that it isn't, but it sounds like prima facie conflict to me, so I'd like to hear why it's not at some point, not today.
Yeah, can we dig into that and bring it back, Mark? It's an interesting question,
Yeah.
and I think it deserves some broader discussion.
So I do have a comment I'd like to make before we take our break here. There is nothing in the Constitution, nor in statute, nor rule that is requiring a conservation easement. Just to be clear as we go into this next conversation.
No, I'm sorry, Russ. We do have in rule the sole use of a conservation easement to meet that title restriction statute. And that's why we suspect there may become a point where you guys tell us we need to consider rulemaking here. So we do have in rule that that is our sole instrument to meet that statute. And now Renee or Miriam or Diane could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure about that.
I think that that's right, and that we have property interest defined in rule to be a conservation easement.
So Russ, we can pull up that rule language and bring that back if that's helpful, maybe after the panel discussion, if that's okay. And Dan, as we come back to, I mean, know that we really want to prioritize giving the panel the 65 minutes they have on the agenda, even our last 30 minutes, if we need to bring that back to the next meeting or share some written materials, we can. So these guys put a lot of effort into panel prep, and let's keep
100%. Yeah, yeah. And I also am feeling like the board and the committee members still have questions. I still have questions I haven't asked. And so I don't know how
maybe
we're
we
going
can
to
hold the last
navigate
30 minutes
this.
just for questions and pull that up if it's useful.
Yeah. So with that, it's 10:27. Why don't we take a 5-minute break? Does that work for folks? And does that work for our panel members? When we get back, we'll jump right into the panel. Does that sound reasonable?
10:32?
10:32.
Yes, sir.
Thanks.
You have a compliant group here, Mr. Co-Chair.
That's good. Before we jump into the panel, Sarah, I feel like, this committee's responsibility is to sum up this information for the full board. And I'm feeling like we're gonna need a little space to do that without violating public meeting rules. And so I don't know how we can potentially create some space for that.
You mean for like more space for you guys to report back at the full board meeting or something else?
I'm concerned that we're not even gonna have time in this meeting to reach consensus on what we want to report back to the board in October.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, what Renee and I would suggest is that because we did think about that a little. I don't think we need to reach consensus. The staff can help the co-chairs in pulling together
Okay.
alongside the co-chair report, like a staff presentation. I think we held maybe 30 or 40 minutes at the upcoming
Okay.
October board meeting.
Okay.
And if
Good.
we don't need
Yep.
to reach consensus, we can say, here are some learnings, here are some reflections, here are some things we heard from board members. So
Okay.
yeah, we don't expect you to use the last 30 minutes to tell us what to do as, a fully unanimous group, fortunately. Although I'm always
Thanks.
tempted to pretend, Dan, just to make you nervous. You're presenting all this at the board meeting. Have you been taking notes?
I think I just heard Russ back. So why don't we, because some of the panel members were not present at the beginning of the meeting, could we have the panel members give a quick self-introduction and then dive in? I don't know who's managing the panel, if that's you, Sarah, or Renee, but I'm
You
gonna
know,
hand it over.
we asked Colt to help us convene and support the panel, which they very
Perfect.
kindly appreciated or took on, which we hugely appreciate. And I know it meant extra work, but I hope it also meant extra flexibility and space to get your messages together and make sure you had time to tell the story you wanted. So I
So
would
then why don't
probably
we
hand
hand
it
it over to
over to
Joe?
Joe, if that's okay, Joe, to kind of lead introductions and kick off the panel. Are you okay with that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks so much. I know this is unique to have a panel of partners lead a long discussion in a public meeting. So I appreciate the flexibility and just the trust to be able to do this. Yeah, we have 5 folks who are going to speak with you today. I'm going to be trying to manage time as we go, and there'll be time for Q&A after each person speaks. And then also, if we've done it correctly, we should have 15 minutes or so at the end for just broader questions. So a big point of this is dialogue in addition to us talking at you. So we're going to try to balance that. It's a hard balance. I also just, foundationally want to say a couple things. I mean, number one, presenting feedback, constructive feedback, and receiving constructive feedback. As humans, I don't think we're very good at it. It's hard, right? But it's key to strong relationships and collaboration. And so I just appreciate everybody's trust and willingness to try this. Um, Also, foundationally, I think we are all after the same thing, which is addressing the really important conservation needs in our state. Um, there's different ways to get there, and I think that the devil's in the details, and this is a really complicated issue. So, yeah, we have 5 panelists. We're going to start with Melissa Coblestrand from the Land Trust Accreditation Committee. We'll have time for Q&A, and then we'll get into some land trust staff here in Oregon. And those will include Amanda Martino from Blue Mountain, Natasha Bellis from Deschutes Land Trust, Nate Ulrich from Columbia Land Trust, and Claire Fox from Greenbelt Land Trust. They'll get into some more specifics as well as a couple of case studies. Just for grounding, I mean, Sarah already mentioned this. This has been a long road of, constant conversations and adaptability over time to get to this important moment. We've heard from land trusts that, the easements are a burden, and we want OM to examine the acceptability of other instruments. But we've also heard that it's not necessarily the easement that's the big issue. It's OEB's risk aversion. So we're going to touch on all of those things today, as well as the difficulty in potentially transferring land, whether it's the federal government or tribal partners. So without any more intro, I'd like to get into things here and introduce Melissa from the Land Trust Accreditation Commission to speak with us first. Ready to go, Melissa?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I appreciate being able to kind of talk with you today about kind of what we do at the commission and what it means to be an accredited land trust. So I know I've been doing like Zoom meetings for like a long time, but let me like click a couple of buttons, make sure I do it right, and share a couple screens because you don't need to look at me. I've got some pretty pictures for you to kind of follow along with. So just give me a second. Okay, so if I clicked all the right buttons, you should be seeing a slide of hiking through the woods. Excellent, thank you. I do know what I'm doing when it comes to Zoom. So I always like to start kind of assuming kind of accreditation might be new to some people, but accreditation is a whole industry, right? That land trust, besides land trust being accredited, hospitals, universities, zoos, aquariums, museums, all these types of entities are accredited, and there's accreditation programs for each one of those. And at its base, accreditation is just recognizing that someone is meeting some standard. And for land trust, that standard is land trust standards and practices, which is a set of national standards that all land trusts who are members of the Land Trust Alliance have to adopt as kind of their guiding principles of kind of how they operate land trusts. And what we do at the commission is we verify compliance with those standards. And we organize those into 4 groups. We look at an organization's governance, finance, transactions, and stewardship, because otherwise it can feel like we're just looking at a lot of pieces, but really at the end of the day, those aren't isolated. But we look to see that a land trust is demonstrating that once they get that seal and that kind of little swoosh, they have responsible governance, sound finances, they do solid transactions, and they have programs and be able to uphold that promise of perpetuity and that lasting stewardship. Today, there are 478 accredited land trusts, which I'm very proud of. I've been with the commission for 16 years, so I've seen kind of that growth in the whole land trust community. And I've been executive director for about 5, almost going on 6 now. Those 478 accredited land trusts are across the country. They're in 46 states, Washington, D.C., and 2 territories. The commission, we are an independent body that is connected to the Land Trust Alliance. That means all of the accreditation functions and the decisions of accreditation live within this body of commission and commissioners. There are 18 commissioners from across the country that represent land trusts and kind of aspects of land trust works. We have CPA, we have an appraiser, we have executive directors. These are the specialists that kind of help build where the sum of all the parts of all of those people bring this expertise to the table when we're making those accreditation decisions. That commission is supported by 9 staff, and that can kind of seem pretty big, but the way we do reviews, it is a partnership between the commissioners as well as a staff member. So there is a good amount of staff support in that review process because those commissioners already on their own are collectively volunteering over 5,000 hours a year. They're some of the hardest working board members that I know, and they're just united in that passion for excellence in the land trust community. I repeatedly hear from everyone like, wow, accreditation, that's a really rigorous process. And that's really because the way the standards works, the standards are really high level and very outcomes based. But when the commission publishes requirements, how are you supposed to measure something and to be able to hold people accountable to that? We actually have very specific measures of what we hold land trusts to in great specificity. We don't want accreditation to be a black box to say, okay, what are you looking for? We try to be really specific about what that is. So that means that outside people can also understand what it means for someone to be an accredited land trust. And those requirements really allow the commission to be able to make decisions that are fair, that are equitable, understanding we have a huge diversity of land trusts across this country. So how do we make decisions that are, unify that accredited land trust community? And to be honest, I could give like a full all-day seminar about the requirements. You're not here for that. You didn't sign up for that today, and I only have 10 minutes. But I did want to give you two examples to really help you understand kind of what that depth and breadth of what we're looking for kind of as part of that accreditation review process. So we take something in the standards that have to do with kind of monitoring conservation fee properties. And we break it into kind of its individual components. And we look to say, okay, well, those monitoring, it's annual, that someone had, that a land trust has those inspection reports that have very specific contents, the day that it was inspected, what property it was, who did it, what are your observations? So we're looking for each one of those requirements. Are those reports completed in a timely manner? And is that methodology of what a land trust and how they're doing inspections, does it actually get to the good outcome of being able to identify management problems on that property? So we list all of these things. These are the outcomes that we're looking for. These are the things we're going to be measuring an organization again, and that's those requirements. We have requirements for each one of those buckets in governance, finance, transactions, and stewardship. And then we're evaluating, are those actual requirements actually met? And when I say evaluation, we are actually looking at an organization's actual documentation to see that those are that they're meeting their requirements. And it's a sampling process. We get different points in an application process along the way. So for example, if we're looking and trying to verify how someone's kind of inspections, annual inspections of properties, we would select a property like the Salmon River property and say, okay, land trust, and we pick it. We don't just say, hey, give us a property. We say, give us the Salmon River property. And then we go through and we say, and we ask for very specific documentation. And then we go through and almost use the requirements like a checklist to say, can I see, do they have each one of these pieces of information along the way? I'm really going through and reading each one of those reports and saying, yep, they have all of these things. And we can see the observations in there. But I would also say accreditation has a philosophy of continuous improvement. So we also do include corrective action and abilities to provide additional information during that process of being an accredited land trust. I just want to give one more second example. So in the transaction section of requirements, we have a series of requirements that relate to title investigation, that it has to be completed by a title company or an attorney, that that actual documentation has to identify the ownership and kind of the encumbrances, and that the land trust has to be able to kind of demonstrate how they've addressed those encumbrances so there won't be ownership challenges, that there won't be kind of that uncovering of things that might impact those conservation values. And then we're looking to see that they update that title investigation just prior to closing, so nothing new comes on before that is. And again, that same thing, here we're looking for the same detailed documentation. So I might say, okay, well, give us the Smith property. And we go through and I look through the fee title deed and the title investigation. I say, okay, well, does the ownership match? Does the legal description, do they kind of make sense between this document and this document? I see all the encumbrances. Do I see parallel document from that land trust that actually address encumbrances along the way? So it is really that, and that's when I started saying this is a rigorous review process because we are doing that over and over again for each one of those requirements. I had a land trust the other day say to me like, oh, okay, you actually do read everything in the application. I said, yes, we do. And they were just really astonished by kind of that level of detail and triangulation and all the things that we could find and help them identify risks and say, okay, well, hey, we can kind of see these things. Here's what you need to be doing better. Here's where we can help you grow and improve. And places that you're doing things really great, and we can just check all of those boxes. Because accreditation is not like a one and done thing. It's not like, okay, we're just accredited, we're good, we don't have to worry about this anymore. Accreditation really is that commitment to meeting those standards. So accreditation is awarded for a period of time, and then an organization needs to come back and renew, and they get that kind of deep dive look again at what their project work was over that prior term before they're awarded the next term of accreditation. So just, I do get the other question. It's like, oh, why should land trust be accredited? Wow, it's a lot of work, and it takes time and money, right? There's money to apply for accreditation. There's staff time to be able to kind of put the application, or board members if you're an all-volunteer organization, to be able to put that application together and go through that process. And I say what I hear time and time again, and we do survey kind of land trust about their experiences and what it means for them to be an accredited. Every organization that we've talked to have said that going through accreditation has made their organization stronger, either going through the first time or being kind of at each subsequent renewal of an organization. I'd say there's organizations who have been accredited for over 15 years now. We've been doing it this long. And I have to say that's strengthening. And I think for me, that's something I've truly seen it having been here for kind of 16 years is you can see that strengthening of those individual land trusts, how much that has truly strengthened, in my opinion, the entire land trust community. Things I saw as issues being 10 years ago are just no one has those questions anymore. Everyone has bought into having baselines at closing. We don't have that as an issue that we have to address during the accreditation process, just as an example, because it is that strengthening of the whole community. But I think in a lot of ways is also about accountability and building public trust in the land, in individual land trust, but the whole land trust community as well. And really accreditation and that third party verification, we're outsiders. People open up their closets. They let us look through all of their attics about all of their work. And having us be that third party verifier really helps build that trust in the community. Because we all do this, we want to have that permanence in conservation. And being accredited really means that that land trust has the resources and the ability to do just that. So I'd say the 470 accredited land trusts have a big impact across this country. They do hold 84% of all land and easements are held by an accredited land trust. So it is a pretty big amount of portfolio across the country. And there are 13 land trusts based in Oregon, in addition to those that work in Oregon. So Columbia Land Trust, they are also accredited, but they're just based in another state, as well as kind of those national organizations like Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Land, Ducks Unlimited. And I'll say another question that I get is, how do other people view kind of accredited land trusts? And how can my accreditation seal be used by, if I'm an agency or a funder or a foundation? And I'd say what I see across the country is a really wide spectrum of things where some places give, they ask about the status and maybe they give bonus points to a streamlined process to being required. So for example, Terra Firma, which is an insurance program that the Land Trust Alliance helped fund, which is it's an insurance for conservation easement and conservation fee property defense. The accredited land trusts do get a discount on their premiums because they're an accredited land trust. There's other programs like in Colorado where there's a state certification program. And if an accredited land trust gets kind of an expedited pass, they don't have to give as many documents. And the documents they do give are really focused on those state programs because we're looking at that national scale. So some of the things that are really specific to the state are not something that we would necessarily verify at a national level. Similarly, the NRCS's ASEP-ALE certification program has a similar approach where to get certified, accredited land trusts have just less documentation. They have to have done less projects. They just have a different process than if a land trust is not yet accredited. But there are some programs that require accreditations. So in Georgia, in order for a landowner to get a state tax credit, they have to have worked with an accredited land trust. And in New York, to be able to get eligible for like some funding for forested conservation easement work, the land trust has to be accredited. So there's just some sampling of that spectrum of how other entities think about accreditation and kind of work it into their work with land trusts along the way. And again, those entities really are using kind of accreditation because that seal really means that third party has verified all of those land trust practices and they can have confidence that we've done that work to verify those things. So hopefully that's just like a little kind of high level kind of summary of accreditation, but I'm more than happy to kind of answer questions that come up now, later about accreditation along the way.
And Joe, if you're comfortable, I'll let you manage the sort of questions and how many to allow before you cut people off.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Dan.
Or Joe, you can just make a really panicked sign to Dan and he'll shut everybody down.
True.
Thanks so much, Melissa. It looks like Mark has a question. come off mute, Mark.
Thanks, Melissa. I appreciate that. Looks like a very rigorous, robust process for accreditation. What I'm interested in, what does that accreditation, what kind of enforcement leverage does that accreditation process provide? Because part of what we're talking about is a desire to enforce at times a conservation, a landowner isn't doing what they're supposed to per the conservation easement. So.
Yeah, no, great question. So we actually have a series of requirements that go under kind of is a land trust enforcing its conservation easements, and we have expect a land trust as part of kind of their annual inspections of conservation easements to then say, okay, well, if you see that there's some sort of issue, then you need to go ahead and you need to start enforcing that. It has to be, you have to take timely action. You have to make sure that the action is consistent with the conservation restrictions, the conservation values. It's not providing impermissible private benefit, and that the land trust is documenting all of these steps along the way. Totally understand sometimes enforcement things take time to resolve, but we are looking for that. And we actually ask land trusts to give us a list of all of the conservation easement enforcements that they've managed over a 5-year period, and kind of how they resolve them and what they're doing. And then if we see something in the document that says, oh, hey, so-and-so's dumping tires and it's not on the list that we saw, again, we'll ask those things. So that's answer one. We do really take a deep dive into how they're doing that. And the same thing on fee properties. If there's ownership challenges, we have that same lens. But I will also say, accreditation, not just one and done, we also have a process over the accredited term. So again, we're looking at an application cycle, but often we'll get public comments from someone who says, hey, we don't think so-and-so land trust, is enforcing the Smith conservation easement. That allows us to kind of come in and take action, understand two sides of the story. And so we do have a compliance confirmation process to check those things. So that's assuming the land trust is doing all those things. If we see a land trust isn't doing those things, like, oh, you're not really taking timely action, that's where we step in and we kind of say, okay, well, what's your plan? How are you going to be doing these things? So it is kind of, that's that continuous improvement process where we will ask for corrective action if we see a land trust isn't meeting the requirements as part of the application. Does that help, Mark?
I
Or is
probably
that not
phrased my
answering it?
question.
Okay, sorry.
I phrased my question not very clear. How does that enable the land trust to enforce if I'm dumping tires on my property and there's a conservation easement that says no, what kind of leverage does that give the land trust over me to actually make me clean that up?
So I think we do require land trusts to have a conservation easement enforcement policy. It gives them the procedures. And I'd say I have seen land trusts, many of them in their conversations with landowners say, we're an accredited land trust. We have to make sure that we're doing this because if we don't, someone's going to come in and it could jeopardize our accreditation status. So I think that's how land trusts do use that as leverage. I've seen that in communications to landowners, like as an accredited land trust. So I think that does give them that additional, like, hey, someone else is looking over our work. It's not just the land trust.
All right, looks like Dan has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Super helpful to hear this. I'm not expecting you had a chance to look at the meeting materials, but hopefully you saw the risk table that was discussed earlier, and there's a category there about operational risk. And it seems to me that, the higher risk examples in that table that included like lack of capacity to effectively hold and steward a property, resulting in negative impacts and not requiring an environmental assessment. It seems like your accreditation process in and of itself is ensuring that accredited land trusts have that capacity. You did talk about due diligence. My question is really, in that due diligence look, does that include sort of this making sure that there's an environmental site assessment done?
That's a great question. So I'd say so in standards, there is a standard that it does say that a land trust needs to do some sort of level of environmental site assessment. Depending on the risk, it could be a phase one or it could just be more a lower review. That is not something we specifically verify and say we must see the documentation for that. But if we see, a land trust completely disregarding that standard and completely like saying, nope, we don't need to do anything, we have the ability to ask questions about that. So I'd say to that specific point. To your point about overall risk about an organization, I would say we do look at the governance aspect, right? So that's kind of, do they have good board oversight? Is the board not, how much information is the board? Is the board paying attention in that piece? I'd say I think we also, thinking about risk, we look at finance. Do they have operating reserves? Do they have good financial health? Are they getting good financial reports? And I think that goes down to some of that foundation of, are they going to be able to have their doors open? Are they going to be able to stay in business because they have these systems in place? I mean, during kind of that next 5 years accredited term. And I think that's how we think about some of those risks, is trying to look at that governance model as well as that financial health and the financial picture, and do require land trusts to have a minimum amount of money set aside for stewardship and defense, and in addition to the operating reserves.
So would it be fair to say that in your opinion, that operational high risk area is addressed through accreditation through your program?
I would say yes. I think we do address that.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question. We are already over where I wanted us to be. So definitely want to take Bruce's question, and then Russ, I might ask you to hold it until later.
We're good.
Thanks. This a quick one. I was intrigued by the insurance discussion or the mention of the insurance policy. Is there potentially a insurance component of accreditation that could ensure OWEB's position, their use of public funds, so we could say that our investment is insured based on performance, et cetera, but where does the insurance, how can the insurance help us?
So I'd say we do require all accredited land trusts to have a general liability insurance policy, and that we do ask that they do an insurance risk portfolio, right? Do they have, insurance required by law, DO insurance, kind of property insurance? We ask them to do a risk assessment of that and say, do you have, understanding your risks, do you have the right insurance? And I would say terra firma is really it's a really great tool for all the land trusts who are kind of part of that, because it will cover, basically that defense of being able to go out, kind of go to the landowner. You can go to the terra firma insurance, say there's a violation, I need help to be able to legally enforce this easement. They can go to terra firma and be able to get that coverage, with limits and everything like any kind of insurance company. So Bruce, I'm not sure that kind of completely answers your questions, because I'm not sure what other things might line up to kind of cover the risks that you're talking about, but insurance and thinking about insurance evaluation is part of what we look at.
All right, thanks so much, Melissa. This is really important to us as a community. Accreditation is a really big deal, and it sets folks up to manage all the kinds of risks and things that come up for OWEB. Ultimately, we hope you see this as a big deal in terms of the level of trust you can have in the organizations that are accredited. All right, I want to move to our other panelists so that we have time at the end. And I'm going to ask panelists to stay within your 5 minutes. I don't want to cut people off. So for our next panelist, we're going to have Marty from Blue Mountain, Executive Director of Blue Mountain, speak. Are you ready to go, Marty?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sound good.
All right, I'm going to do my best on 5 minutes. Well, thank you everybody for the time to speak today. I also just wanted to echo Joe's thanks to the OWEB staff and board for all of the time and energy you're putting into this process. it takes a lot, and we just have really appreciated the ability to dive deep into this work with you. As Joe mentioned, I'm the executive director at Blue Mountain Land Trust. We were founded in Walla Walla in 1999, so we work in both Washington and Oregon. We own 2 properties and have 22 conservation easements that collectively protect over 24,300 acres and over 40 miles of rivers and streams. We've been accredited since 2013, and we're currently in the middle of our second reaccreditation application, which, as you've heard, is a pretty rigorous and in-depth process. And that accreditation has really informed our perspective and just our design as a land trust to last in perpetuity. And an important piece of that perspective is that we look at risk a little differently than what's been discussed so far. So I want to just talk a little bit about that and how for land trusts, the real immediate risk of losing land and water, of losing a property to development or permanent non-conservation use is a more dire critical risk than potential future risk of long-term protection issues. And I think the most striking example of the differences in how we perceive risk is that the prepared risk matrix didn't list loss of a property or permanent loss of habitat as a risk at all. Degradation of habitat was a listed risk, but not permanent loss. I think that's a really big part of the conversation that we need to have in light of the goals of it being a land acquisition program. And as you're aware, land acquisition is highly opportunistic, and we may wait decades for the opportunity to protect a critical parcel of land. For example, we purchased a property called Phipps Meadow, which includes the headwaters of the Middle Fork of the John Day River in 2021. That property had not changed hands in almost 20 years. And its sale was one of those opportunities that you don't plan for, but you have to react to when it arises. The John Day Basin Partnership identified the headwaters of the Middle Fork as one of its Tier 1 highest priority areas for ecological uplift and species benefit in the basin. We were the only resident land trust and partner who could move on a tight timeline to acquire that important conservation property. And when we secured the option to purchase, we only had 4 months to make the purchase. That's not a lot of time to do a lot of due diligence and line up financing, but we had to take the chance to ensure we didn't let this opportunity for conservation ownership and future restoration pass us by. We were able to complete an incredible amount of work in a tight timeline and move forward that knowing while future issues may arise, that risk was eclipsed by our concerns that we couldn't wait 20 more years to obtain a key piece of our watershed in the face of a rapidly changing climate. After we acquired that property, it took us nearly 2 years to complete the OEB conservation easement grant process. We are still working through our final management. That 2 years to finalize the conservation easement and complete that process added about $30,000 in interest payments to our loan, hundreds of hours of staff time, and thousands of dollars in capacity, in addition to our work in managing the property itself. And I think one of the things you've heard from other land trusts are some of the challenges with the approach to the conservation easement process that make it difficult to complete timely conservation, results in some of those missed opportunities. We want to make sure that we're not letting concerns about completing perfect projects get in the way of completing good conservation work. For example, when we negotiate with a private landowner to purchase a conservation easement on their property, we are frequently in direct communication with the landowner's legal counsel as we negotiate, waive their title encumbrances. However, under OEB's current practices, land trusts are not able to speak directly with DOJ attorneys. And so it is a little bit difficult to negotiate a transaction when you're unable to address the other party's legal counsel directly. We're oftentimes unable to ascertain whether concerns are staff interpretation of DOJ feedback or DOJ's actual determinations. Direct conversations between all parties could reduce the time it takes to go back and forth, provide transparency in the decision-making process, and foster better collaboration to address risks and concerns. We see this as a critical issue with the process and emblematic of the greater issues related to risk aversion. We also want to point out that the land acquisition program is not administered consistently with other OEB grant programs such as restoration. We consistently hear about OEB's concerns around ensuring responsible stewardship of public funds and assured conservation outcomes, which we all agree are important. As nonprofits, we are very sensitive to responsibly deploying public funds to complete our mission. However, we feel that this argument and reasoning, which is often cited as a reason for the risk-averse approach in the land acquisition program, is not consistently applied elsewhere. Many of our members are also completing restoration projects or partnering with other entities to do so. We have directly experienced a difference in the level of scrutiny, required due diligence, and level of assuredness in conservation outcomes between the two programs. And in our opinion, there are more assurances about conservation outcomes in subsequent land management practices and land acquisition than restoration, because our work ensures long-term stewardship under conservation ownership. There are also examples of restoration projects that haven't been executed perfectly or according to plan. They may not have achieved their ultimate restoration objectives or may have had unforeseen challenges that require design changes or subsequent phases of restoration. And we embrace that flexibility in restoration. We encourage entities, partners, and resource managers to learn, continue to invest in these projects, and adaptively manage their restoration projects. Why not apply the same approach in land acquisition, trusting the implementer to adaptively manage issues over time? I want to be clear that I'm not advocating for additional restrictions or due diligence requirements to be applied to restoration program. It's clearly a highly successful program that provides critical fish and wildlife uplift around the state. I am, however, just pointing out that the differences between the programs and levels of risk tolerance and flexibility in implementation could be and should be applied more equitably to land acquisition. I think I've definitely gone over my 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop there, Jeff.
You did pretty good. You went over a minute and a half. We've got time for a question or two specifically for Marty, and then we'll keep rolling. Any questions for Marty? Yeah, Mark.
Thanks, Marty. I really appreciated that. My question or request is more for OWEB staff. I would, not today, but at some point appreciate better understanding what the relationship between DOJ and staff are and how you might address the concern that Marty raised, whether it's DOJ or OWEB staff. Secondly, I would like to know if that 2+ years to complete a conservation easement is standard and why. It does seem excessive to me, but I've never done it. And then I think lastly, just a better understanding of what the inconsistencies between OWEB programs are, whether they are there and whether maybe it's warranted. So that's another discussion, but those are 3 things I'd appreciate.
Noted.
Mark, those are, you want us to respond to those later? Okay, I see Renee taking notes and I've got those in my notes.
Yeah, we don't need to do it now. I know we're pressed for time and I think it'd take a little bit of time.
Great. Thanks. Let's move on to Claire. You ready?
Great. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. And if my audio gets a little shaky, just let me know and I'll turn off my video. Okay, thanks. So I'm here to present another case study. So my name is Claire Fox. I'm the conservation director at Greenbelt Land Trust. Our organization has been protecting lands and waters in the Willamette Valley for 36 years. We are also an accredited land trust. So Marty touched on OWEB's approach to project risk. The risk aversion that we have seen as part of OWEB's program administration adds many obstacles for land trusts, as Marty shared, but that ultimately become a drain on capacity, taking away both our staff time and our resources that we could otherwise be spending on the ground conservation. So I'd like to share an example of when this risk or this culture of risk aversion created such a burden for my organization that ultimately we gave back a $1 million grant award. The project was called Oak Creek Preserve. And for the fee acquisition of this Benton County property, we included within our OWEB proposal a conceptual trail plan and an emphasis that this property was a missing puzzle piece in a regional trail network. We were prepared to marry this habitat restoration goals and also access to the outdoors for our community. Public benefit. With trails being an explicit part of our application, our project was recommended to be funded. But our notification of grant award came with this litany of contingencies, about our staff capacity, investment policy, a road risk analysis, and we provided this flurry of memos for OWEB staff before we could move on to the next phase. But the biggest hangup was always about this proposed trail. That was part of our original proposal and was recommended as a project. Over the course of several months, we witnessed hurdle after hurdle to prove that our proposed trail and related infrastructure would have zero impact on the conservation values. This burden of proof was very great for a conceptual plan on a property that we did not yet own. It became increasingly clear that we were not going to be able to advance our community's vision of trails without meeting significant barriers, not just during the acquisition period, but over time. So let me say that again for you. Not just in the moment of during the acquisition period, but we were anticipating this kind of risk-averse relationship for years and years to come that would drain our staff capacity and take away from our ability to do real conservation work. There was an active sense of distrust, no trust that we were an organization with this rigorous accreditation, that our staff were experts in the field, in their fields, or that our plans to restore the habitat and provide access to the outdoors were not thoughtfully designed. Ultimately, we determined that the burden of working with OWEB on this acquisition outweighed the risk of finding alternative funding. We rescinded our application and turned down the $1 million award. So we're talking about conservation easements also, in tandem with risk and risk assessment and risk aversion. And so it was not, in this case, not specifically conservation easement language or requirement that pushed Greenbelt away from this grant. All of this transpired even before we got to the conservation easement negotiation. Meanwhile, OWEB's culture of risk aversion is tied to this perpetual conservation easement, because when you use conservation easement as a tool, the staff has very restricted interpretation of its rights and responsibilities. So I'm asking of this committee, is it possible that reconsidering the conservation easement requirement would allow OWEB to reevaluate its relationship with project partners and establish stronger trust? So I share this story, again, as a real example in which conservation opportunities were lost because of OWEB's distrust in the applicant. And the burden of proof was us for so great to avoid all risk. And I want to say there's no such thing as no risk. We are working in land protection. We are working in the realm of real estate. Every property is unique and no transaction is zero risk. Meanwhile, accredited land trusts are perhaps the entities that are most prepared to take on this risk. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And yeah, I just want to note for folks, it's hard to tease the specific buckets out, as Sarah mentioned earlier. So we are covering a lot about risk today, but it's foundational to all of this. And so just wanted clarity on that. Thanks so much, Claire. We've definitely got time for questions. Jamie, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thanks, Claire, and others as well for your presentations. Very helpful. I hear your frustration and the desire and the commitment you have. That's unquestioned. The desire to do really great work for the state. And I heard also the piece about accreditation and that rigor that goes into it. I actually, when I was thinking about it, I was thinking actually staff gets caught in between this because they've also got to speak to the board and often get caught in between these two pieces. But do you have any thoughts on if OWEB were to be less risk averse, how not everyone's going to be able to succeed, and there will be some things that fall through the cracks. So any thoughts that you have on what some of the recourse might be? What would be a reasonable recourse if there were to be more flexibility, which would probably result in more failure, and failure's not always a bad thing, but if that rigor would not have been placed, and if your organization or another organization like yours who didn't have the level of staff to be able to do some of that work, if that things would have fallen through the cracks and the project would have failed, that's going to come back first to staff and then to the board. And what are some of the steps that we could take or recourse we could have that could help kind of make us right with this investment of public resources? Any thoughts that you or your colleagues would have be very helpful.
Well, I wonder if like what your definition of what a project failed would be, because the big risk that's on the table is that there is an ecologically important piece of land that could be developed, right? Usually that's the big threat is that this is going to, the natural resources on this property are going to be extracted or paved over or something of that degree. So by a land trust acquiring a property or a conservation easement on a property, the big picture there is we are protecting this land from being developed. So if a project has failed, does that mean it's developed or impacted in such a way that's not reversible? It's like so ridiculously unlikely that that kind of uh, high impact would happen under the stewardship of a land trust. When we're talking about smaller, potentially like infractions, a tractor went through this property on a muddy day and there's some soil compaction, like that this tree was removed without permission because it was potentially a safety issue. Those are the levels of infractions that usually we're dealing with or asking OWEB for permission or guidance about. And that level of infraction is
No, thank you. That's super helpful. And I'll just
okay.
flag for staff that what's the definition of failure, I think is a takeaway there.
Okay, thanks.
Nate, did you want to weigh into that question before we take Dan's?
Really quickly, Commissioner, thank you for focusing on the definition of failure. In 35 years and having conserved 60,000 acres at Columbia Land Trust, we've never had a project failure. And it's important to define what failure is. It sounds vague. It sounds like a big threat. Of course, there's going to be a homeless encampment on a property from time to time. That is not failure. That's a standard stewardship obligation that we deal with on a regular basis. So I appreciate your focus on that point.
Thanks, Nate. Dan, let's take your question.
Sure. I think it's more of a question for our OWEB staff, I think, and then kind of a vague comment. But the question is, so this seems like it falls again. I appreciate the risk table because it's a good guiding post, and this seems to fall into that strategic policy bucket. The description there is reputational damage, negative public perception, and political risks. And I almost feel like this project failure could, I mean, the failure of us not having the opportunity to use OWEB funds to fund this project, that seems like a high risk example to me. And I'm just wondering if in the high risk example column, we should consider including this as a risk that we're not able to use funding for this kind of a project. And again, I don't need an answer now. I'm just putting a pin in that. My broader kind of, as a public voter in the state of Oregon, not as an OWEB board member, when this vote came to voters, it was bundled with state parks. And I just wonder, like, for the general Oregonian, whether they actually see this humongous distinction that we're drawing here about, multi-use, right? It's like, heck, when I voted for that, it's like, yeah, buy land, improve parks. It was like one big thing. And so some of this entanglement about conservation and uses, particularly those uses that have the opportunity to bring the public onto a land that's been acquired and educate them about the value of conservation while they're there. It's just, again, it's It's not something that we need to go into, but it's just that sort of bigger picture foundational thing. I don't know how much the people that we all work for sort of draw as big of a distinction in this stuff as we're drawing and as we're particularly expressing in our high risk category. So again, just a comment.
Dan, can we actually bring that back in the later access and use conversation, and we'll use that to help frame up the question a little bit more clearly when we get there, if that's okay, in a future meeting.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
All right, let's take Mark's question, and Dan, if you can just shoot me like what our end time is. I lost track because we took the break. But Mark, why don't you go ahead with your question first?
Thanks, Claire. Again, that was great too. I just want to be clear. I understand the criticism or complaint in a constructive sense that I took from you is that Greenland is an accredited land trust. The accreditation process is robust and rigorous. And what I thought I was hearing, you didn't say this, but I'll be somewhat pejorative, is that the OWEB staff were second guessing that and required you to do a lot of additional proof of that. And that took a lot of staff time and capacity, and it risks losing what would be a really important conservation value. Is that accurate or not? It's different than what I remember reading in comments about the trail. So I'm hearing you complain about
Not
you're
complaint,
accredited.
constructive criticism.
Constructive criticism. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, well, in the testimony, there are two different examples of trails. So just want to call that distinction depending on which one you were reading at the time. Yes, but the broader criticism is about culture of risk.
But is that tied to the accreditation process where OWEB doesn't? And I don't know that this is fair to OWEB, fair to you, but this is just what I heard. You're a solid accredited outfit, but they still required us to do a lot of proof of that. And it just required a lot of extra work because they weren't willing to take the risk that we are who we say we are. Is that not accurate to what you were saying?
Yeah, that's a pretty good read.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Then I would ask OWEB if that's your takeaway from the process we're talking about at some point.
I mean, I want to leave as much of the space sort of absent of our staff voice as possible, but I do want to say I don't think any of us want our grantee partner experience to be what Claire described. And I think, we regret any time that's the impression that comes across as a lack of trust or a lack of understanding of our shared mission. And we have to follow the law. And I think this gets back briefly to, Dan's previous point. We can't just imagine what the voters thought. We have to implement what's actually written in law as interpreted. And I guess I would really welcome an opportunity to bring this project case study back if folks are interested later, to dig a little deeper into that trails question, because I can see how I wasn't here then, I can see how we may well have gotten there based on a concern about recreational impacts and the distinction between those two Measure 76 purposes. And I think what you're pointing to, Mark, is a really ripe opportunity for some process improvements. I think we have some boxes in our diligence process that can be checked with land trust accreditation. Could we do a better job of that? Is there something in internal guidance that we can look to say, hey, we can worry less about this if it's an accredited land trust? Keep in mind, we also do this program with non-accredited land trusts and non-land trust organizations. And so we've got to kind of have that full universe of potential partners in mind. But I think I'd suggest to not get in a back and forth over the project, but like maybe we can get together with Greenbelt and come back with a little bit more detail on what actually happened in perception of potential impacts from those trails, and share a little bit more detail in a future meeting if that's of interest to folks.
Then my comment and my question is the trail issue, the language sounds way too prescriptive and unrealistic. So that is worth talking about. On what I'm keying in on here, if a land trust is accredited per the standards we're talking about, why wouldn't they just check a box and then that's not an issue? And that would be different for those land trust or entities that aren't accredited if we're talking about making this more efficient and less costly. So that's.
I see Renee writing, and I think that could fall in our potential program improvements that could fall probably without a rule change if I had to guess, but we can dig into that more in a future meeting for sure.
Renee, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just really, really quickly, Joe. So Mark, there is a bit of differentiation in the grant application around accredited versus non-accredited. So, and I don't think that is the entirety of what Claire is talking about. So I do want to underscore there are pieces of that there, and I think there's more to be unpacked from the case study that Sarah suggested we bring back maybe.
All right, we really need to move on to other panelists. I want to bring Nate to the group here from Columbia Land Trust.
Thanks, Joe. So my name's Nate Ulrich, and I'm the Conservation Director at Columbia Land Trust. We work along the lower 250 miles of the Columbia River in both Oregon and Washington. 7 years ago, in 2018, Columbia Land Trust applied for and was awarded funding for a nearly 2,000-acre conservation acquisition south of the Dalles in Wasco County. The property had long been a conservation priority for partners in the state because of its high-quality Oregon white oak habitat. It was a relatively simple fee title acquisition with the added benefit of having an existing conservation easement across roughly 2/3 of the property held by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, a national conservation group with a land trust of its own. The existing easement had the benefits of reducing the cost of the acquisition and facilitating a partnership that could bring additional resources to support future land stewardship. What happened, however, was that OWEB determined that its easement was not compatible with the existing Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation easement, and that the Elk Foundation had to subordinate its easement to OWEB's as a condition of funding. That determination created a requirement that another land trust had to violate best practices and potentially undermine its own Land Trust Alliance accreditation in order for us to use the OWEB funding. Ultimately, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation determined that OWEB's requirement would cause it to violate its LTA accreditation and refused to subordinate. As a result, the project failed. That outcome cost Columbia Land Trust tens of thousands of dollars in lost staff and contractor costs, hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost matching funding, years of work, and significant lost opportunity to have advanced other conservation in Oregon. In this case, we believe that a standard notice of grant, as some federal agencies use in Oregon, or a deed of right, as some state agencies use in Washington, would have effectively met the state's goal of protecting its financial interests and ensuring conservation outcomes. We cite this example to highlight that OWEB's decision to use a conservation easement, combined with a prescriptive approach to implementing the easement, has real consequences for the ability to achieve the intended outcomes of the land acquisition grant program. I've heard that a core reason OWEB chooses to use an easement and amend it with site-specific requirements is that it's necessary to responsibly steward public funds. We as land trusts are also responsible to others. We're responsible to our donors, to our partners, and to our nonprofit mission. If we invest years of staff time at all levels of our organization without a high level of confidence that a straightforward transaction will be completed, then we're not being responsible to those who have entrusted us. As capacity limited organizations, we have to choose to work in places where, in exchange for the difficult and long-term work of creating high-quality conservation opportunities, we can have confidence in the ability to achieve project outcomes. At Columbia Land Trust, we've determined we have to avoid that risk. And over the past 7 years, we have not invested in new land acquisition conservation work through the OWEB Land Acquisition Grants Program. While we are still working today to conserve this property in partnership with OWEB, it's come at the organizational cost of having to develop a new project approach and raise additional matching fundings from new donors. That in turn means fewer resources for other important conservation work in Oregon. As you continue your review of this topic, I'd ask you to consider 2 more points that we believe are important. The first is whether it's possible that in focusing thoughtfully but narrowly on the risks associated with the land acquisition grant program, the responsibility to protect Oregon's most important places has lost emphasis. This program should have a clear priority for achieving conservation. At Columbia Land Trust, over the last 7 years that we've been working on this one project, we've completed 56 land conservation projects and conserved over 20,000 acres elsewhere in our service area. By the end of 2028, we will have completed our largest land conservation effort to date, working with 8 public agencies, dozens of private foundations, to conserve nearly 75,000 acres in Oregon and Washington at a cost of $120 million. The OWEB contribution to that total will be less than 1%, and the land acquisition grant contribution will be less than 0.5%. I'd also ask you to consider that funding-related deed restrictions of any kind place a legal responsibility for achieving and maintaining project standards on land trusts. We take on the responsibility and the risk of failure because any form of deed restriction requires grant recipients to make reparations for failed outcomes, not just conservation easements. We take on this responsibility because it's our mission to do so, and therefore our obligation to work to improve outcomes for the ecosystems and the people of Oregon. I appreciate your time on this effort, which we consider to be very important. And I also appreciate the opportunity to share Columbia Land Trust's experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Nate. Do we have, let's take specific questions for Nate, and then we might have some time for just some more broader questions for the whole group. And we're gonna unfortunately have to drop our good friend Natasha from the panel just because I think we planned too much, but that's okay. This dialogue is really important.
Joe, I defer to the chairs, but I think we can bring our final agenda item later if you guys wish to continue and if the board wishes to continue with the conversation, we'll bring back our final presentation to a future meeting.
Yes.
I think the
Sounds
board
good.
may appreciate some time for general discussion and questions at the end, but I'd defer to the co-chairs how much time to hold for that. I would hate for you guys to prep and not have a chance to talk.
Yes. Let's hear from Natasha.
All right. Well, let's take Mark's question first, and thanks for that flexibility.
Thanks, Nate. Can you share what the different or the disagreement about conservation values were or are between Rocky Mountain elk and OWEB?
I can say from Columbia Land Trust perspective, we did not perceive any difference in the conservation values, but there was skepticism that the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation's conservation intent was to the same level of OWEB's intent. That was not our perspective.
So nothing that you could point to that OWEB has A, B, and C, and Rocky Mountain Elk has C, D, and E in terms of desired outcomes or conservation values?
I would say that OWEB is much more specific in its desired outcomes. The Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation easement was more general in its desired outcomes.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, that is something I think we should talk about at a later date is what our expectations are. I know that on the Maui here, we've been pushing for end result contracting in terms of how contractors giving them a variety of ways to meet the same desired outcomes. And I'm wondering if something like that isn't relevant to this conversation and might free up some of this or avoid some of this.
Yeah, we can spend some time exploring that, Mark. I think, I don't want to speak to the specific grant. I think the organization's missions are different, right? And so I think that's worth a little examination, but I see your broader point for sure.
All right, I don't see any more hands, so let's pivot to Natasha and then have a little bit for any final questions.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for making time for me this morning. My name is Natasha Bellis. I'm the Conservation Director for the Deschutes Land Trust. We're based in Bend, but work throughout the Deschutes Basin. And I'll be brief today in the interest of time, but definitely want to thank you for the opportunity to be a part of OWEB's land acquisition modernization process. Above all, the Land Trust values our strong partnership with OWEB and the critical role the land acquisition program plays in protecting Oregon's natural resources. So, like others, our overarching concern with OWEB's current land acquisition program is the agency's culture of risk intolerance. Policies, procedures, and mandates are often narrowly interpreted and strictly enforced, and this hamstrings OWEB staff's ability to use discretion to take calculated risks that could facilitate land acquisition projects. And this isn't to say that protecting OWEB's investment should take a backseat to approving projects. Risk management is very important. However, policies, procedures, and rules designed to avoid worst-case scenarios have made the land acquisition program too rigid, and in many cases, as you heard today, unworkable for land trusts. And as a result, OWEB's funding is underutilized. We think requiring conservation easements to meet the title restriction provision of the statute is an example of this risk intolerance, even though that tool might not always be the best one, depending on the specific circumstances of a proposed project. And OWEB staff and board should have as many tools as possible. And this, I think, is a thread that we will tie throughout all of the questions that we will be exploring here. They should have as many tools as possible at their disposal to complete good projects that meet the objectives of the program while still meeting OWEB statutory obligations. Simply put, more flexibility equals more projects and better partnerships. And it doesn't have to come at a high risk to OWEB. Rather, it will involve calculated risks, combining the suite of tools available to OWEB with additional protective measures that many land trusts have come to the table with, including, as you heard today, LTA accreditation, our own articles of dissolution, and just our own track records that we have with OWEB. Many of us have worked with OWEB since our inception. So it is possible to see how OWEB can push its comfort zone without foreclosing important requirements. So we just want to urge this committee to consider using alternative approaches where they can. Doing so will ensure OWEB can fund more projects that deliver on Measure 76's promise while still maintaining strong oversight. And with that, I'll be quiet.
All right, thanks, Natasha. Any questions for Natasha specifically?
I do have one. So, Natasha, you speak to the success of the land trust, and I appreciate that. But the little bit I understand, the context of that success is primarily based upon the use of conservation easements. And I remain unclear why land trusts feel like we could back off of that and be as successful or more successful when, at least in Oregon, we don't have any evidence for that or any basis for that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I think that there might be a couple of different issues there, Mark. We do use conservation easements. We hold conservation easements. Roughly half of the acres that we protect are in conservation easements. We're speaking more specifically to the conservation easement that OWEB holds on all funding related to land acquisition. So these are our fee title properties that are encumbered by OWEB's conservation easement. So yes, we definitely support the use of conservation easements, which I believe was the rule that Sarah had referred to earlier, that property interest. I think that rule set speaks specifically to sort of us holding OWEB funding and land trust holding conservation easements. And this is a little bit different. Like this is OWEB using title restrictions to encumber land that they are helping to fund to protect. And so that's, I think, where our specific issue and issues with other land trusts exists. And how do we do that differently to allow more projects to go through? And again, those would be fee title acquisitions.
Okay, thanks. So I have more to understand.
Oh God, it's very complicated.
This is very complicated, and to my experience over the last 10 months going to OWEB board meetings, you board members are asked to understand a lot about a lot of different programs, and kudos to you for wrapping your heads around them. Bruce, what's your question?
Yeah, as I listen to all of this, I keep wondering if OWEB staff, I'm assuming OWEB staff is making decisions responding to concerns that they have all within OWEB's statutes, rules, and policies. So every decision that is made by OWEB staff. I think this kind of testimony, while enlightening to board members and it has us asking the right questions, puts board members in an awkward position that they listen to it and they think they start to question staff decisions. I think in order to move forward for the committee, I would love to hear staff requests for how they might, what they need, or if anything, or what they think they might need to address the issues that you're bringing up. I don't feel like I've heard anything that makes me want to question staff as far as intent or desire to approve and give away the money for these projects. But they're obviously being constrained by something. And we talk about risk, but that gets back to the question that who exactly is it that cares about these individual decisions? So I don't think that this committee can go much further without having a very candid discussion of what kind of requests that OWEB staff and management would like to see happen to address these issues.
Can I comment on that quickly, co-chairs? I really appreciate that, Bruce, and I especially appreciate your point about the intent of staff and the shared intent, and I know our partners recognize that as well. We asked this group to come and really share the nuts and bolts of the concerns that we're having and partially to get all of the gestalt of that together with you and us together so that we can start parsing it together. And I think, we're taking good notes and there are issues that have come up here that are very familiar. And there are issues that came up where I was like, oh, I see what happened now. Like I understand to a greater level of nuance or detail than I really did before where these frustrations are coming from. And I think that's a very helpful conversation. And so I think having had this in a public venue really allows us to see together what the opportunities and challenges are ahead of us. And I think you're right, and a number of folks have pointed to kind of a risk-averse culture. And I want to acknowledge that's something that very much changes in board leadership, in board makeup, and in executive leadership and makeup. Those things change over time with different levels of risk tolerance, risk aversion, different perspectives on different kinds of risk. And so I really want to emphasize our roles as executive leadership and board in figuring that out, because we do have situations where right where we've been told that we have too risk averse of a process, we'll bring it to the board, as I've mentioned in the past, and get a pretty strong implication from individual board members that we haven't really done our due diligence and we need to try harder in the future. And we've had a series of executive directors that approach these projects from very different perspectives. And I think one of our Measure 76 panelists even brought up that my boss in the governor's office, Jeff Huntington, ran OWEB and frankly kind of lost his job over one of these projects because it was so politically contentious. And so we do operate, and I think some of what we are wrestling with here is driven by strict interpretation of statute, constitution, rule, where we're like, man, our hands are tied unless you guys change one of these. And we're happy to work together to see if we can craft a path for that. And there are things where we've responded to an external or internal culture in making these decisions. And I think we, as the leadership of the organization, of the agency, need to, wherever that came from, take responsibility for it and see if we as a board and executive leadership team need to recalibrate and send some clear messages to staff about, to Jamie's point, what do we do with this risk? Where does it live? How do we understand it? And to reassure staff that I'm not going to punish them, you're not going to punish them if something sneaks through and a project, funds something that's not clearly consistent with our constitutional purpose, or, a project reaches, a financial failure or a legal risk that we didn't anticipate. And so I'm really hoping that the nuance of this conversation can help the board and me be good ambassadors in our community and the committee to be ambassadors back to the rest of the board and understanding the grantee, the applicant experience as we try to balance those and find the right approach to risk management as the leadership of the agency. So sorry, Bruce, that was a very comprehensive, but you and I were thinking along the same lines, which is like, this is coming from somewhere and it's not fair for us to look down. It's fair for us to look up.
Yeah, Chairs, I'd just like to make one last quick comment. I would love to hear from staff. The explanation I would like to have done, except this stopped me. That would give us the idea of what it is culturally or by statute, rule, policy that has stopped them.
Yeah, happy to. I'd suggest we look for a case study to dig into that in a future meeting, Bruce.
Well, I don't know.
I think we should make some sort of an exception to retain Bruce for a longer period of time so he can get that discussion.
It is technically permissible for non-board members to join committees and certainly to join committee conversations and meetings. So I just want to say that, Bruce.
So I'd like to make a comment for both the staff and for the guests that are with us today. Again, we're now charged with a modernization process. There has been multiple processes to this point, and a lot is at stake for us to achieve the true modernization that is being asked of us by the governor and the governor's staff. So what does being bold and what does being innovative look like on the part of the staff, and what is holding you back from getting to that point, and how can this process help us break through those barriers? And from our guest perspective, what does it mean to be bold and innovative look like? And also, what are the barriers that you see essential for us to truly get a modernization process moving forward in place where you can come back to the table and feel like we are doing the essential work embedded in the Constitution?
I defer to our guests on that question because we can answer it later, and they're here now.
Yeah,
what does big and bold look like to you guys?
It's a hard question to answer quickly.
We don't have to do it today. I mean, we can give you time to eat. You know, we shouldn't feel the pressure of the close of this meeting. I would like to really understand from your perspective what that would look like. I'm hearing critical losses of habitat are at risk because of our process. And I am hearing that critical time delays from acquisition to actual close on easements, causing extraordinary staff costs and delays as issues. But I want to understand, you are the experts. You're dealing with this. If you could really give us a comprehensive perspective of what success will look like, that's extraordinarily helpful to this process.
Marty, do you want to address that?
I don't know that I would call this response comprehensive or representative of all of the land trusts. I'll just preface it with that. I think some of the things that we've asked for you to consider today fall in that bold and innovative action category, and that we're asking you to trust when a land trust purchases a fee property that a conservation easement may not be the only tool for ensuring that investment long term, and to have a little bit more of an analogous process with other grant programs where we are embracing adaptive management and we are not seeing a imperfect project as a failure, kind of redefining what that failure is. To throw a barrier out that we have not yet discussed, that is a very real challenge for us in Oregon, given that we have very few funding sources available for this work, is the funding allocation to land acquisition relative to the entirety of the OWEB budget. We have, I think, $8.5 million is allocated to land and water acquisition for this biennium. And with just one or two land acquisition projects, that could easily be tapped out, given the cost of real estate in this state. And just would implore you to consider that as a barrier for us to do our work, and increases that level of, I think, scrutiny that we're facing. And some of that is because there is limited funding sources. And yeah, I'll stop there and let others chime in if they want, but I think having a little bit of time for us to come back to you with a more comprehensive response would be very appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mark, is there a question for the panel? Am I even still facilitating something here?
You are.
I'm getting close to taking it over, but yes.
Okay.
Why don't we have Mark go, and then Renee, did you have a follow-up on what somebody just said that should be said before Mark, or?
The only follow-up is, I think, to Russ's point, we need to dig into this more, and I feel as though we have a logjam breaking already. Even by starting this conversation, we've had 15 pre-application consultations on specific projects for this current grant cycle that's open. That is an enormous amount compared to what we have seen cumulatively over the last several years. That does not diminish Marty's point about the amount of funding available. So I just want to recognize, though, there is interest being shown. I agree with Sarah. Some of that is about federal funding, and some of it, I think, is even just opening this conversation so we can get into these challenging issues that have tripped us up for well over a decade.
Thanks. Go ahead, Mark.
So my question's a bit more specific than Bruce's, though I look forward to the panel or a broader community response to that. We were talking a lot about or focused on conservation easements today. And I know that y'all have indicated you really don't like them for all applications. But my question is it really about having more types of ways to do your work, or is it about the implementation of conservation easements currently? If that makes sense.
And if I can add on to that, because I shared Mark's, well, I'll just say I had my own confusion about the distinction that I think it was Natasha was talking about earlier, a conservation easement versus something different about a fee title acquisition conservation easement. Not that we're going to get into that today, because we are going to spend the last 5 minutes of this meeting talking about next steps. But go ahead, Nate.
I can be really fast. Mark, there's been earlier discussion about some challenges to easements related to other partners, federal government, tribes. Specifically, I can say we work with conservation easements with other funding entities that do not create site-specific and project-specific requirements that rack up and make the easement difficult to impossible to deploy. Other entities have a template easement that gets utilized on every project that goes forward. And that's a significant difference to the utilization of the tool. So that's why you're hearing the tool, but also the application of the tool.
Okay.
I'll just take a chance just to wrap real quick with our group and say thank you for this time. This is very complicated, very detailed. I learned from Trust for Public Land the other day that Oregon's ranked 33 out of 50 states in terms of conservation financing and public funding from the state level. So for me, bold and innovative goes beyond just the current programs of OEB, but like OEB as a state rising up to the challenges in front of us, and look forward to working with many people, over the years to increase funding, but we're falling short. We're resting on our laurels in a lot of ways when you think about the problems we're all facing. And I know we all want to do more, and we're in a very nitpicky space about how we can do more in this, but when I think bold and innovative, I think Oregon in the top 10 states. in terms of, funding as a percentage of overall budget. So anyway, thank you so much. I know we went way over, but I think this was interesting, and you can't really understand where we're coming from without hearing some case studies, understanding accreditation. So hopefully it's helpful for folks, and look forward to future conversation.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. And
Thanks,
we
Joe.
so appreciate partners, how much time and effort and thinking and cooperation you put into bringing us these stories today. And they were painful to hear. Like, I have to say, we asked you to bring us nuts and bolts and get beyond the like, this is frustrating, into what specifically is frustrating. And it was really painful to hear. And I want to reiterate what I said earlier to the board, which is, I mean, I think there are some projects here that if we sat down and we said what, in isolation, how we experienced it, and grantees describe how they experienced it, that we'd probably have some pretty different stories to tell you. But we felt it was important to not get in a back and forth and undermine the messaging. And I think, having looked at it comprehensively, I don't think anything we're going to say is going to undermine the key points that stand and that our partners are telling us. And we have responsibility as an agency, not only for our actions, but the impact that they have on other organizations. Um, so that's a responsibility that we as an agency, and I as an executive, and you as a board, need to take, to say, look, okay, we got here for some good reasons. I appreciate the comments about positive staff intent and shared commitment, because we got here because people were trying to do their job and do it well. And so now we have a responsibility to explore whether we can, within existing policy, create a more workable approach, or, and I know state agencies are always hesitant to say this, do we need to change rules or maybe even statute to make this thing work better? If you guys want to do a constitutional amendment, you'll have to find yourselves another executive director. That makes it, makes me tired even just to think about. But I think there's a lot of room for these improvements and changes. And I know, staff are ready to dig in. And I think we can bring back what the board has described in terms of some options. I think in wrapping up, I would just say the messages that we bring to the board in our October conversation, I think we've answered the question in my mind without always being, as Joe said, directly answering the question. But I'm hearing several broad streams of like, there are challenges with the way we're implementing conservation easements. The biggest problem with conservation easements per se is the intersection with tribal sovereign governments and potentially also with federal government transfers. And there's also I think, a symbolic theme that I hear here, which is like, if you guys want to prove that you're going to actually change the way you do this, you could just open up this one thing that we've been talking about for a long time. I want to be clear with the board that it would require a rule change for us to explore a broader set of instruments. And I think maybe where staff can come back next is, what are the changes that we feel that we could make to the way that this process is implemented? And I'm not saying next meeting, or certainly not October full board meeting, but like, what do we think we can change without opening up the set of instruments, and explore some more nuance around that? I also heard where we had themes of recreational access or other access and use issues coming out, or even future habitat conditions. Let's see if we can bring some shared messaging and case studies to the next conversation, and really dig into the details a little bit more on that. So that's kind of where I see this conversation heading, as I appreciate so much Colt's convening, and the fact that you guys clearly shared the nuances of differences in your own community about different perspectives on the use of easements, whether, when, and how much, it's a how we use them versus if we use them. I do want to share one more reminder that this grant program is available to anyone who undertakes the program requirements and builds a competitive proposal. So this is a really focused conversation with the land trust community. You're the preponderance of our applicants. Mark Webb suggested a while back that we hear from Association of Oregon Counties. We've been in contact with them, making sure we're checking in with other partners, to Bruce's, who cares comment, talking to legislators, talking to county commissioners, talking to folks who bring perspectives other than the grantee perspective, as well as with tribal governments. And I think we need to do a little exploration of what other applicants or potential grantees we should also be exploring this with us outside of the land trust community. We'll continue our tribal conversations and consult with our advisors on some of the ideas that Jamie raised. And that's the end of my summation. But Bruce, you will still technically be a board member, I believe, at the December meeting. I'm not 100% sure, but I
Well,
think so.
I just want to remind my colleagues that the rule change process does not necessarily end up with rule changes. It is a process that explores a lot about what we want to do with rules. It also, by its sheer function, will determine who cares about that particular issue. We are thinking about doing this. So I would caution my colleagues not to be too scared of the idea of a rule change process. It can be very illuminative for a variety of reasons, even if we don't end up changing the rules.
Yep. And the board doesn't have to decide what goes into the rules until after you hear from all the Rules Advisory Committee and just decide whether adopt or not to. So pressure's off a little bit there too.
We're 2 minutes past,
Co-chairs,
folks.
I can see
So
Dan getting fidgety.
yeah,
Chris,
we
thank
gotta
you so
wrap
much
this
for
up.
joining us today.
And we'll obviously be punting our last agenda item to a future meeting.
We'll
And
bring it back.
yep, sounds good. Thank you everybody for your time today. Much
Thanks.